They didn't just build cities. They carved legacies into the bones of the earth. While others battled for survival, they gazed at the stars and etched celestial maps in stone. Their temples scraped the skies, their aqueducts whispered of brilliance, and their calendars, flawless in precision, seemed touched by time itself. Yet one by one, these civilizations vanished. No screams, no ruins ablaze, just silence. Heavy and absolute, 30 worlds, 30 riddles, each one swallowed whole by time, leaving behind only questions. Some were buried by the fury of nature, others erased by envious enemies, but most, they dissolved into shadows so thick, even history cannot breathe their names. Follow us as we descend into the haunting echoes of civilizations, lost in a blank mysteries that continue to haunt scholars, explorers, and dreamers alike. Don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the unknown. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know. Wishing each of you health, luck, and a touch of wonder on this strange and beautiful path through the forgotten past. The Indus Valley Civilization, a beacon of peace in a brutal age. Imagine it, while empires bathed in blood and boasted of conquests. These people chose a greater glory. Their cities gleamed with order, streets laid out in perfect grids, bricks uniform as if kissed by a mathematician's dream, homes, not just for the elite, but for many. Boas de private toilets, their wastewater gliding through underground channels, more disciplined than some of today's urban sprawls. This was 2,600 years before the Common Era, when the world still stumbled over the wheel's invention. Here, they flushed away chaos with a serene dignity no rival cared to emulate. Then, like a candle snuffed out, the Indus Valley Civilization dissolved. Rivers still danced. The earth endured, but the cities stood hollow. Their script fell mute, their people scattered, perhaps woven into other tribes, or lost to time's relentless tide. No charred ruins, no fields of bones, no defiant carvings to mark their end. Just a hush, a fade so complete, it feels like a dream's edge. When Mohenjo-Daro was unearthed in the 1920s, British archaeologists waded through the ghostly remnants of a society so pristine it seemed to mock their tools. They'd found a specter with no tale to tell. This wasn't a fleeting settlement. At its zenith, it cradled perhaps 5 million souls across over 1,000 villages and cities. Urban planning, sanitation, metallurgy, precise weights, and measures they traded with Mesopotamia, their seals journeying as far as Oman. Yet they penned no epics of gods hurling lightning, carved no triumphs into stone. They seemed indifferent to whether future ages sang their name, as if fame were a burden too heavy for their steady hands. That indifference might be why we let their memory slip. Here's the haunting truth. They did everything right. They shunned war's clamor, elevated public health to an art, and bore no trace of iron-fisted rulers. No imperies, no kings, no crypts glittering with gold. It's as if a council of engineers, obsessed with order and allergic to vanity, designed a society where power flowed not upward, but outward. Like ripples on a still pond, you see it in their city's bones. No palaces looming over the masses, no gilded quarters, for the few just a brick-by-brick hymn to equality. Yet, around 1900 years before the Common Era, a fracture began to spread. Cities emptied slowly, their heartbeat fading, trade routes withered, populations dwindled. In a handful of generations, the once vibrant order unraveled, not with a crash, but with a sigh. Perhaps the last souls in Mohenjo-Daro lingered, watching drains clog with neglect, granaries yawn, half empty, their script fading into meaningless scratches. A civilization that tamed chaos with precision slipped quietly into the earth's embrace, leaving only whispers to haunt the sands. The veil over their downfall remains unlifted, a riddle wrapped in the dust of ages. Scholars weave theories like fragile threads, chasing shadows of truth. Some whisper of climate's cruel hand, how the monsoons shifted their ancient dance, or how the Sarasvati River, once the region's beating heart, withered into a ghost. Others murmur of the earth's restless bones, earthquakes that twisted rivers' paths, turning fertile fields into barren wastes. There are those who speak of plague, a silent thief stealing breath, or of a culture stretched thin across countless cities, its unity fraying, without a single voice to bind it. Yet these are but guesses. Lanterns flickering in the dark, no myths, cry of vengeful gods. No frescoes scream of invaders at the gates. No final letters mourn from crumbling outposts. Their collapse left no echo, only a void where a story should have been. And perhaps that void is the tale, the indescript. A cipher of secrets still guards its truths. Thousands of inscriptions, brief as whispers, adorned seals, likely markers for trade. Names etched in time, but no Rosetta Stone has emerged. No bridge between tongues, and the symbols stand apart, alien to all we know. They defy us. Closing tighter, the more we pry, as if the Indus people wove their legacy to elude memory's grasp. Perhaps they shunned fame's fleeting crown, choosing instead to let their deeds' plumbing's quiet genius, sanitation's steady hand, outshine the clamor of self-glory. They might have believed a life of order and cleanliness outlasted the hollow chants of priests or the boasts of kings. If so, fate played a bitter jest, for history turns a deaf ear to silent virtue. It craves the roar of conquest, the clash of swords, the drama of blood-soaked banners. Lewder voices followed, drowning their whisper. The Aryans swept into the subcontinent, their Vedic rites blazing, their horse-drawn chariots thundering with a fury the Indus seemed to spurn. Slowly, the older memory faded, overwritten by fire and song, yet not entirely, for their cities linger, silent, untouched, spectral, beneath ancient streets. Sewers still snake with purpose. Bricks align with a precision that humbles machines, but their voices lost. A melody swallowed by time. Their mystery endures not for what we uncover, but for the silences they left behind, words unspoken, tales untold. Perhaps they vanished, not in a single night, but in the slow collapse of memory, when no one remains to sing your song. Their end, too quiet for history's grand stage, lacked the spectacle to be etched in eternity. Maybe they were too advanced, too harmonious, forgetting to carve their name in stone. History punishes those who don't shout their own myth. It immortalizes the loud, the brazen, while the soft-spoken fade. And speaking of whispers, another ghost city lies half buried in desert stone, not as ancient, but no less enigmatic. Carved into the crimson cliffs of southern Jordan, it stands like a dream sculpted for an audience that never came. Columns and facades rise from mountainsides, as if the rock itself yearned to proclaim divine truths. The Nabateans crafted Petra, not merely to dazzle, but to dissolve into legend's embrace. They didn't just vanish, they left the lanterns burning, their glow unanswered. No one knows why. The Nabateans. To step into Petra is to enter a mirage made real, a slender chasm. The Seek slices through rose-hued cliffs, a corridor where stone itself seems to breathe with secrets. A serpentine path slithers through sandstone for nearly a mile, weaving, tightening, pressing close. Towering walls, kissed by wind and scorched by sun, loom overhead, their shadows pooling like secrets. Then, as if the desert exhales, the passage yawns wide, unveiling a marvel, the treasury. Al-Kasne, a 40-meter-high Greco-Roman facade, chiseled into the cliff's heart, its columns standing proud. It's as if a divine sculptor, weary of earthly plains, sculpted a dream from the mountain's bones. Impossible, yet achingly real. For ages, mortals assumed this grandeur must cradle a king's tomb. What else could justify such splendor? But no king rests within, nor anyone at all. The Nabateans, those cunning architects of absence, left behind. a masterpiece, devoid of themselves. A stage without actors, Petra was a whisper in the desert, a tale told by nomads and sketched in the voids of ancient maps until a Swiss explorer, cloaked as an Arab pilgrim in 1812, coaxed a Bedouin guide to reveal its truth. What he found wasn't merely a city. It was time's frozen ballet. Temples, tombs, stairways spiraling to nowhere, an amphitheater carved from the mountain's flesh. No homes, no palaces, no thrones. Only facades and shrines, riddles etched in stone. The Nabateans vanished, yet left their set dressed as if the curtain might rise again. Who were they? Their origins slipped through history's fingers like sand, emerging in the 4th century, before Common Era. These nomadic Arabs seized a vital artery of ancient trade: frankincense, myrrh, silk, spices, turning Petra into a mirage of wealth, a desert fortress woven from illusion. Merchants, engineers, artists, and masters of deception, they spoke Aramaic's cadence, adorned their works with Greek and Roman flourishes, and buried their dead with seals blending pagan whispers and hints of a singular god. They gathered cultures like treasures, yet guarded their essence from prying eyes. Petra's wonder lies not only in its stone, but in its lifeblood water. In a land where they reign is a fleeting guest. The Nabateans tamed the desert's thirst with dams, cisterns, aqueducts, and channels, making the barren bloom year-round. They danced with flash floods, carving paths to guide torrents into hidden reservoirs. Every drop was cherished, purified, rationed, sustaining 30,000 souls. Where life should have withered, wealth, trade, cultural agility, spiritual enigma, and water in the ancient world. This was a hand no rival could match. So why did they fade? They answer: eluded us. A magician's final sleight. By the 4th century Common Era, Petra was a specter. Rome had claimed the Nabatean kingdom centuries before, yet the city pulsed on until it didn't. Trade routes drifted to the sea, earthquakes scarred the stone, and some say Christianity's tide reshaped their sacred spaces into churches. Others claim they merged into Rome's embrace, or simply wandered away, dissolving into the sands like their beginnings. Sands. No cataclysm, no invasion, just a quiet. Et Ashur, just for they chose to vanish from history's gaze. Their invisibility haunts us still. The treasury bears scars from 19th century Bedouin bullets, fired in vain to free imagined riches. Petra is a city crafted to spark wonder, daring you to unearth its truths. Yet, peel back its layers, and the Nabateans remain elusive, their absence a melody that lingers in the desert silent. Forever out of reach, a serpentine chasm winds through rose-hued sandstone, stretching nearly a mile, its walls narrowing as if guarding a secret. Sunday-scorched cliffs tower above, their smooth faces whispering tales of eons, shadows pooling like ink in their crevices. Then, as the path relents, it unveils a marvel, the treasury, Al-Kasni, a 40-meter facade carved into the cliff's heart, its Greco-Roman columns standing as if a god grew weary of mortal plains and sculpted eternity. Impossible, yet it breathes before you. Many deemed it a tomb, for what else could justify such grandeur but a king's final rest? Yet no king, no soul, lies within the Nabateans. Elusive, architects of absence, left a masterpiece empty of themselves. A silent stage for a play never performed. Petra lingered as a nomad's whisper, a myth etched in the margins of ancient maps. Until 1812, when a Swiss explorer, cloaked as an Arab pilgrim, persuaded a Bedouin guide to unveil its truth, he found not just a city, but a performance frozen in time's embrace. Temples, tombs, stairways spiraling to nowhere, an amphitheater hewn from stone's core. No homes, no palaces, only facades and shrines. riddles carved in crimson rock. The Nabateans vanished, leaving their set dressed as if the curtain might rise again. Their origins slipped through history's grasp, emerging in the 4th century, before Common Era, as nomadic Arabs who seized the lifeblood of ancient trade: frankincense, myrrh, silk, spices, transforming Petra into a mirage of wealth. Merchants, engineers, artists, and illusionists. They wove Aramaic cadence with Greek and Roman flourishes, burying their dead with symbols blending pagan whispers and hints of a singular divine. They hoarded cultures like treasures, yet veiled their essence. Petra's genius lies not only in stone but in water, taming a parched land with dams, cisterns, and aqueducts, channeling flash floods into hidden reservoirs. Every drop sustained 30,000 souls in a place where life should have faltered. Wealth, trade, cultural agility, spiritual enigma, and water, an ancient royal flush. Yet, by the 4th century Common Era, Petra faded into shadow. Rome's grip, shifting trade routes to the sea, and earthquakes scarred its glory. Some say Christianity reshaped its shrines. Others, that the Nabateans dissolved into Rome or drifted into the sands. No cataclysm, no invasion, just a quiet exit, leaving a city to haunt the ages. The Nabateans' lives, their stories, their architects' names erased, leaving only stone-carved whispers. Their inscriptions, meditum markers, offer scant Aramaic clues, taunting scholars for 2 centuries. Historians curse their elusiveness. Artists worship their enigma. Tourists capture their echo in fleeting photos. The Nabateans didn't just trade spices. They dealt in absence, crafting a city to outlive memory, yet refuse its secrets. Petra is their punchline, a masterful misdirection. Some civilizations blaze and fade. Others crumble in chaos. The Nabateans left a masterpiece, dimmed the lights, and slipped away without a word. As if absence was their intent. Petra wasn't a home, but a performance. A mirage so intricate, it blurs the line between reality and dream. They understood the desert, forgets, unless given cause to remember. Shift the map eastward, millennia back, to Nigeria's heart, where a deeper mystery slumbers beneath the soil. The Nok culture, older than pyramids or Rome, left no cities, no script, only terracotta faces with alien gazes, elongated skulls, almond eyes, flared nostrils, high cheekbones. Some don headdresses. Others ride horses, their expressions frozen in dignity or disquiet, sculpted over 2,000 years ago, and buried as if hiding from unseen eyes. Initen Tuuriait, a Nigerian tin miner, unearthed a head, shrugging it off as he sought ore. British colonial eyes took note, and soon hundreds of figures emerged, flooding museums and private hands. Named Nok after a nearby village, this culture thrived from 1500 before Common Era to 300 Common Era. Among West Africa's earliest iron smelters, their sculptures, intricate yet stylized, pulse with meaning. Portraits, not idols, heavy, with unspoken purpose. No cities, no temples, only art, plundered and scattered. Its context stolen by looters and greed. Some figures wear armor, others ride horses centuries before equines reached the region. A paradox etched in clay. Were they traders, linked to distant webs, or isolated visionaries, forging iron and art in solitude? Their faces, unlike the flattened forms of early art, capture individuality, exaggerated brows, complex hairstyles, asymmetry, breathing with life. Why did they vanish? Scholars point to overworked soil, deforested lands, or fractured tribes. But the Nok left no empires, no kings, only memory carved in clay. Were these grave markers, ancestor effigies, or masks for gods pretending to be human? Their gaze, haunting and alive. Feels crafted for the dead, or for watchers beyond. They offer no narrative, only silence, staring patiently as if awaiting a language we've yet to recall. No myth or monument greeted us, but identity raw, vivid, and then shattered into fragments. Today, countless Nok treasures languish in private vaults, their origins veiled, their truths reduced to guesses. Nigeria wrestles with the scars of colonial theft, reclaiming some pieces while others remain adrift. Yet even those displayed, polished, and cataloged, guard their secrets tightly, refusing to yield their tale. They weren't crafted to confess. The Nok whisper that the deepest enigmas don't always hide in grand cities or gleam in gold. Sometimes they lie beneath our feet, their terracotta gazes challenging us to unravel their riddle. Their silence isn't emptiness, it's a shield. A sentinel preserving the past from the present's hungry jaws. Linger a moment longer in Africa's embrace, and ascend to the Ethiopian highlands, where another mystery hums in the thin air. Here, a civilization carved stone spires to pierce the sky, traded with Rome's might, minted coins that gleamed with pride, erected towering obelisks, and claimed to cradle the Ark of the Covenant itself, only to dissolve into the mists of conquest and conversion. The kingdom of Axum, a titan of wealth and ingenuity, now a faint echo etched in stone. History has wronged Ethiopia, its maps deceptive, its timelines skewed, its textbooks dismissive. Nestled in East Africa's highlands lies a civilization that rivaled Rome's grandeur, bartered with India's mystics, stood shoulder to shoulder with Persia, and still guarded a relic of divine legend. The Aksumite Empire, a realm that forged its own currency, birthed its own script, and sculpted a legacy in unyielding granite. Yet today, few could pinpoint Axum or unravel its vanishing. African empires, unlike Rome's theatrical fall, don't collapse in a blaze of glory. They fade, as if history's gaze wandered and never returned. For 6 centuries, from the 1st to the 7th century, Common Era, Axum reigned as a colossus. At its zenith, it spanned modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, stretched into Sudan and Yemen, and brushed Arabia's shores, straddling 3 continents. It knew its power. Persians, Byzantines, and Romans bowed to its presence. In the 4th century, the Persian prophet Mani crowned Axum among the world's 4 great kingdoms, alongside Rome, China, and Persia, a titan erased from modern memory. They spoke Ge'ez, a tongue still chanted in Ethiopia's sacred rites. Their script danced across stone, and their obelisks, granite giants over 30 meters tall, rose without modern tools, not mere graves, but skyscrapers for the departed. A defiant boast to the heavens, Axum wielded something Rome lacked: a faith woven with myth's weight. Ethiopian Orthodox lore claims the Ark of the Covenant vessel of the 10 Commandments, radiant with divine wrath, rests in Axum, hidden in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, guarded by a solitary monk, bound to silence and seclusion. The Ark remains unseen. No photos, no tests, only a claim cloaked in centuries of mystery. Its secrecy, sharpening its allure. Is it truly there? Likely not. But belief, stretched across time's vast canvas, becomes an artifact as potent as stone or gold. The Ark's unseen presence weaves through Axum's saga, its legend, a sacred flame kindling Ethiopian identity. It anointed kings with divine grace, sparked holy crusades, and cast Axum not merely as a power, but as a celestial cornerstone of the ancient world. Its vanishing, then, haunts like a song cut short, with no single culprit to blame, no fiery comet, no emperor undone by treachery. Axum's decline was a quiet theft, as if the earth itself slipped away, a tide retreating from shores it once cherished, The land grew parched under climate's cruel hand, and the Red Sea's shifting winds dulled Axum's ports. In the 7th century, Islam's rise redrew the tapestry of faith and trade, turning Arabia, once Axum's ally, into a rival stronghold. Trade routes, once veins of wealth, drifted elsewhere, while drought, deforestation, and eroded soils sapped the empire's heart. Yet no moment felt like the end. Here lies the uncanny truth. Axum didn't shatter. It drifted. It reshaped itself, a river finding new paths. Its royal court wandered south to the highlands, sowing seeds for Christian kingdoms that blossomed into the Ethiopian Empire. Its soul endured. Reborn, the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved like miracles from living stone, are Axum's spiritual heirs. The Solomonic dynasty, born of Solomon, and Sheba's mythic union, carried Axum's flame. The Ark's legend, not fading, but weaving itself into Ethiopia's very essence. Yet the empire's frame, its bureaucracy, ports, and global reach crumbled to whispers. Axum's fall is a riddle, a collapse that wasn't. It flickered from titan to sacred echo, its obelisks standing as silent guardians of a legend outrunning time. Stranger still are its coins, etched with Greek script, bearing kings and crosses, tracing Axum's leap to Christianity in the 4th century, a step ahead of Rome's Constantine. These coins, solid as truth, sing of a kingdom shaping the world's pulse. To mint your likeness in metal is to demand reverence. Then, the forges fell silent. The Greek inscriptions vanished, prestige scattering like leaves in a desert storm. Ruins linger, obelisks piercing the heavens, tombs murmuring beneath the earth, pottery and tools faintly echoing. But no final chapter, no defiant stand, only silence and faith. Axum didn't burn it, dissolved into myth, a sacred void cloaked in granite, its heartbeat still thrumming in Ethiopia's soil. Now, journey to an older, gifted enigma, where the first temple rose not for worship, but to cradle memory. In southeastern Turkey, Göbekli Tepe whispers secrets older than writing, farming, perhaps even myth itself, buried with intent, as if to erase not a people but the truths they held. It stands a circle of megaliths predating Stonehenge, adorned with carved beasts, empty of graves or homes. No script, only pillars, and a question humming in the stone. Once a humble hill in Turkey's arid plains near Syria, shrouded in brush and rubble, it waited, unremarkable, for its mystery to awaken. For centuries, farmers dismissed it as a mere hill, a quiet swell in the earth. Unworthy of memory, they tilled their fields, herded their flocks, and let time drift onward, oblivious. Then, in 1994, a Kurdish shepherd's foot brushed against a secret buried shallow carved stone jutting from the soil like a giant's finger, clawing to reclaim its place in history's tale. Archaeologists descended, their spades unearthing a revelation that shattered civilization's story. Göbekli Tepe, ancient beyond reckoning, predates the pyramids by 7,000 years, older than Stonehenge, agriculture, or the written word, a site that defies existence. Hunter-gatherers, we thought, roamed wild, too consumed by survival to dream of temples. Yet here they stood, crafting wonders. Massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some heavy as 20 tons, rise in circles up to 30 meters wide, their surfaces alive with tails carved in stone snakes, lions, boars, birds, scorpions. Some bear abstract sigils, others wear humanoid forms, arms, fingers, belts, loincloths, each a whisper from a lost tongue. These aren't mere rocks, they're voices, stories etched for an audience time. Forgot, stranger still, they buried it. With care and purpose, they shrouded this marvel under mounds of earth, not ruined, not forsaken, but hidden, a secret sealed as if memory itself were dangerous. Why? The question gnaws, upending our timelines. Göbekli Tepe hails from 9600 before Common Era, before pottery, metal, or villages. When nomads supposedly lacked the art of unity, yet they built a temple before cities, wove faith before civilization. We long believed the path was clear. Agriculture birthed surplus. Surplus built cities. Cities cradled religion, plant wheat, store grain, raise walls, then conjure gods to make sense of storms. Göbekli Tepe inverts this tale. Perhaps faith came first, a spark drawing scattered souls to gather, not for food, but for ritual. Belief, not bread, may have tamed us. Then, for reasons cloaked in shadow, they chose to erase it. This wasn't a single act. Over centuries, new enclosures rose atop the old, the site layering itself like memory sediment, yet its makers entombed it. A deliberate act of forgetting, a cultural veil drawn tight. Some call it a sacred farewell, a spiritual cleansing. Others see a fractured society burying its past to strip its power. The carving's predators, vultures, scorpions pulse with intent, not celebration. This isn't a harvest shrine. It's a sanctuary for what stalks the soul. Some whisper the animal reliefs map constellations, an ancient chart of the stars. Others dare suggest the site mourns a cataclysm, a comet strike around 10,900 before Common Era, ushering a mini ice age that erased humanity's earlier chapters. Speculation, yes, but Göbekli Tepe's silence lures us in. Barely 10% of it is unearthed. Radar hints at vast secrets still buried. A book whose first page we've only glimpsed. Nearby, sites like Karahan Tepe and Navala Chori echo its form's similar pillars, similar carvings. This was no anomaly, but a culture, born after the Ice Age, crafting the era's grandest sacred complex, only to be swallowed by time. No script, no names, no myths survived, just stones. Their wild, hostile carvings, staring with unyielding eyes, offering no comfort, only questions. Göbekli Tepe's stones gaze outward, indifferent, as if we're beneath their notice. This place doesn't feel crafted for human hearts. It feels like a mirror held to humanity, then shattered and buried. Standing among its pillars, you can't help but wonder, what truths have we lost? What secrets were entombed before we knew they existed? What if civilization's dawn lies far deeper than we've dared to dig? The builders left no boasts, no royal crypts, no carved decrees, only a question chiseled in stone. Why do we preserve some memories and bury others? This riddle leads us to another enigma. A people who sewed towers across an island, left no written trace, and slipped away, as if through a hidden door. Sardinia's Nuragic civilization, with its 8,000 Duragi mysterious stone sentinels, sprouts like mushrooms across the land, their purpose cloaked in shadow. Who were they? Why towers? And so many, where did they vanish? At dawn, glide low over Sardinia's rugged hills, and the Nuragi emerge, ancient towers, scattered like chess pieces, abandoned by gods tiring of their game. Over 8,000 stand, each unique, guarding hilltops, valleys, or shores. No one knows their makers' names or the dreams that drove their creation. The Nuragic civilization thrived for nearly 2,000 years, from 1800 before Common Era to 500 before Common Era, yet left no script, no proclamations, only these cyclopean towers, silent and unyielding. The name Nuragic is our own, born from the structures themselves. Their true name is lost to time. No kings, no conquests, just stone and secrets. Each Nuraga, a truncated cone of dry stone walls, harbors, spiraling chambers within. Some stand alone, others cluster amid villages, wells, temples, and megalithic tombs. The grandest, like Sunaraxi at Baramini, weave multiple towers with corridors and ramparts, their spiral staircases curling through stone like whispered invitations. Fortresses, observatories, shrines, their purpose dances just out of reach. Scholars clash over their meaning. Some see defensive bastions, raised for war or watchful eyes. Others sense sacred spaces, their lofty forms, a hymn to the heavens. A few call them tribal boasts, stone emblems of prestige in a prehistoric race for glory. Yet the Nuragic people offer no answers. Their silence, a wall as sturdy as their towers. These builders, meticulous and unyielding, hauled stone without wheels or blueprints, crafting Europe's most intricate megalithic works, driven not by fame, but by a vision we can't grasp. Their decline is as veiled as their dawn. No cataclysmic clash, no sudden exodus, just a slow dimming, a scattering of stones, a culture unraveling without a chronicle. As Phoenician traders skimmed Sardinia's coasts, the Nuragic pulse weakened. By Rome's arrival, the towers stood as ruins. Were they conquered, absorbed by foreign tides? Did their society fracture under strife, scarcity, or shifting lands? Or did they choose to fade? Their anonymity, a defiant act. Their towers, more enduring than words, hint at intent beyond history's grasp. Stone resists time's erasure, yet the Nuragi guard their truths tightly, standing resolute under sun and storm, daring us to decipher their silent song. Some align with celestial rhythms, as if whispering to the stars. 8,000 towers, yet no names. A people who seem to foresee our gaze, leaving riddles in stone, eternal and unyielding. Some Nuragi greet the solstice's dawn, others turn their gaze to the sea's endless whisper. Theories swirl like Sardinia's winds. Perhaps these towers formed a vast network, a prehistoric web, where smoke, fire, or horn calls leaped from stone to stone, linking the island in a dance of light and message, a Stone Age internet, humming across centuries. If true, these weren't mere structures, but voices in a chorus. We've lost the melody to towers stand tall. They watch, they remember, claiming the high ground in earth and spirit. To raise a tower is to proclaim the sky's weight equals the soil's. Perhaps the Nuragic people saw gods in the heavens, or feared what descended from them. Were they reaching upward or bracing against a threat? Without their words, we grasp at shadows. We unearth their sites, catalog their shards, date the embers of their hearths. Yet their hearts remain veiled. Fear, awe, pride, guilt. These breathe life into a people. But the Nuragi offer only stone. Yet these stones pulse with presence, more than relics. They're witnesses. As if Sardinia itself holds memories we've let slip. Even modern Sardinians stand puzzled by their ancestors' legacy, the Nuragi woven into their identity, yet elusive. A riddle unsolved. Tourism hails the enigma. Museums chase its code, but the truth is stark and chilling. We don't know them, never did. Perhaps that was their intent. The Nuragic people may have built not for fame, but to outlast, their towers mocking our quest for answers. Proving permanence lies not in stories, but in enduring silence. Now, shift to a mystery, older still, where history's edges blur, the Cucuteni Tripilia culture, spanning modern Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania, built sprawling cities for nearly 3,000 years, outlasting Egypt, outliving Rome, then burned them down, not once but repeatedly, with purpose. From 5,400 to 2,700 before Common Era, they thrived. Their circular villages swelling with 10,000 to 15,000 souls, colossal for their time. They tamed wheat and barley, herded cattle and pigs, wove flax into cloth. Their pottery, alive with spiraling patterns and geometric hymns, rivaled Greek finesse. Yet every few decades, they set their world ablaze. Homes still brimming with tools, food, and clay, reduced to ash, not by war or chance, but by choice. Why? The question haunts. Evidence speaks of ritual, consistent layers of ash, fire-scarred floors, collapsed walls, homes torched at their prime, a cycle etched into their soul. These weren't cities as we know them, unfortified, open to the sky, yet designed to self-destruct, as if ruin was their rhythm, collapse coded into their very being. No swords or shields clutter their sights. No walls guard their homes. The Cucuteni Trapilia villages spun outward in circles, like mandalas mirroring the cosmos. A serene order, untouched by war's clamor for millennia. Yet still, they set their world ablaze. Perhaps it was purification, a sacred rite to cleanse the land. The air, the weight of years, lived in one place. Maybe they believed a home spirit, like smoke, needed release to avoid stagnating. A dance of renewal for body and soul. Or perhaps it wasn't ritual at all, but fear a shadow cast by a darker truth. Some whisper the fires were born of desperation, not devotion. The land, strained by sprawling settlements, may have faltered, its soil spent, disease creeping through crowded homes, tension simmering until fire became their only escape. Burn it before it festers. Erase it before it betrays a final act to seize control of their story's end. What unsettles most is their endurance. Cultures that torch their homes rarely linger, yet the Cucuteni Trapilia thrived for 3,000 years. A resilience that defies reason. Their pottery grew finer, their villages swelled. They wove trade with neighbors, adapting through time's tides. Then, around 2,700 before Common Era, their flame flickered out, the fires ceased, and with them, everything else. No invasion scars, no graves of slaughter, just a quiet exhale, a culture dissolving into silence. Did they wander off, blending with Indo-European tribes from the steppes? Were they swallowed by another's myth, their voice reduced to a murmur, or did they, azebir, set their past alight and walk away? Their pottery endures thousands of shards strewn across fields, painted in red, black, and white spirals that seem to pull the eye into eternity. Are these proto-words, a script that never spoke? We can't crack their code. The spirals twist, mocking our linear tales, whispering that history curls inward, that progress is a flame to tend or be consumed by. Some see their proto-cities as a bold experiment, communal, equal, un warlike utopia, unmatched until modern times. It outlasted empires, yet faded all the same. Was this failure or triumph? Perhaps they never sought progress. Their cycle of building and burning may have been their truth, a reminder that all things turn to ash. They raised no pyramids, bend no epics, carved no idols, just homes. Then struck the match, a culture of fire and forgetting. Their legacy poses the oldest question. If nothing endures, do you build anyway? Now, turn south, to Spain's sun-scorched plains, where another lost world gleams with gold, sails, and a tongue no one can unravel. Its mystery as deep as the rivers that cradled it, a civilization fabled for wealth beyond dreams. Its name shimmers in ancient Greek tales, Tartessos, a land that gleamed like a fevered vision, then sank beneath time's waves. Some call it myth, others whisper of Atlantis. But Tartessos was real, nestled where the Guadalquivir River meets the Atlantic's embrace. Buried under silt and centuries of silence lies a city that once dazzled like a desert mirage. The Tartessians spoke a tongue no one could grasp, mined gold and silver from rugged peaks, and sailed ships across seas when most of Europe still fumbled with crude boats. Herodotus sang of their king, Argantonios, who ruled for 80 years, opening his arms to Greek travelers, like a host of legend. The Greeks painted Tartessos as a realm of flowing metal, vibrant culture, and effortless grace. Yet no Tartessian city has been unearthed, no native script decoded, no clear trace of their end. They flickered into history, then vanished as swiftly as a shadow from 1200 to 500 before Common Era. Tartessos thrived in what's now Andalusia, a bridge between Mediterranean bustle and the Atlantic's mysteries. Traders, miners, metallurgists. They drew silver from the Sierra Morena in such abundance that Greeks dreamed of a golden Eden, but for all its riches, Tartessos left only whispers, undeciphered inscriptions, neither Indo-European nor Semitic, artifacts blending local and Eastern styles, and elite tombs at La Jolla, brimming with ivory, gold, and far-flung treasures, proof of their vital role in ancient trade. Then, around 500 before Common Era, Tartessos vanished, not a slow fade, but a sudden silence. Coins ceased, inscriptions halted, trade goods vanished. As if the world unplugged their light, some point to Carthage, the rising power, hungry for control of Mediterranean trade, perhaps launching a merciless campaign to seize Tartessos' wealth and crush a rival. Whispers speak of archives burned, priests slain, earth salted a purge, leaving no trace. Yet no battlefields, no bones, no siege scars support this tale. Others look to the land itself, the Guadalquivir shifting, harbors choking with silt, floods swallowing lowlands, or overmined hills bleeding dry. When wealth depends on the earth's bounty and the earth turns stingy, a kingdom doesn't roar, it simply stops breathing. Then there are those who, gazing at Plato's Atlantis, note Tartessos' perch beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a rich realm, lost in a day, coincidence, likely. But Atlantis is less a place than a pang, a greatness devoured by oblivion. Tartessos was devoured, whether by blade, flood, or forgetfulness. Herodotus didn't dream it. The gold didn't mine itself. Its echoes linger in later Iberian cultures, in bronze plaques, with cryptic scripts, in nameless treasures, in foundations whose purposes we guess. What haunts is how close we came to knowing them. They brushed literate worlds, traded with chroniclers, yet their voice was silenced, perhaps deliberately. Riches, fame, and connections couldn't secure their legacy. A truth buried in Andalusia's mud. History's tide rolls out, and without something solid to cling to, entire peoples can vanish. The Tartessian script, still undeciphered, stands like a locked vault, taunting archaeologists and linguists. A complete language, used for centuries, yet no Rosetta Stone has emerged to unlock it. Maybe it was phonetic. Maybe it held myths in a code only they understood. Was it sacred, secret, or just a message they thought time would preserve? Like so many lost cultures, the Tartessians might have believed they had forever. History celebrates the loud conquerors, destroyers, but the silent disappearances cut deeper. Their quiet heavier than stone. Tartessos didn't burn out. It faded like a candle snuffed by a sudden gust, unnoticed, never relit. Across the seas, deep in Africa's heart, another mystery rises, not built, but carved. Its stone towers and cliffside tombs defying the jungle's grip. A kingdom nearly erased by those who couldn't believe Africans could craft such wonders. The Chachapoya, known as the Cloud People, dwelled where the Andes kiss the heavens, where mists twist like serpents and jungles whisper secrets into stone. They built fortresses on peaks no mortal should have scaled, placed bones in cliffside tombs, and faded before the world could name them. From 900 to the late 1400s, Common Era. In Peru's northern Andes, they thrived among ridges and shrouded forests, leaving not gold or script, but the sheer audacity of altitude. Kulap, their greatest creation, sits 10,000 feet above the earth, a city fortress of over 400 circular stone homes, encircled by walls towering 60 feet high, built with intent, not whimsy. Quilap both proclaims and conceals, a sentinel and a specter. From above, it stretches like a dream woven in mist, its bones draped in moss and fog, with narrow gateways forcing invaders to bow one by one. Defense ritual, a silent vow. The answer slips through our grasp. We know the Chachapoya through the Inca, who subdued them in the late 1400s, and the Spanish, who scorched what remained. By the time questions arose, the Cloud People had vanished. Their legacy endures in haunting splendor, tombs carved into sheer cliffs, mummies swaddled in fine cloth, curled as if cradled in the mountain's embrace, humanoid sarcophagi, solemn and sorrowful, perch in high crevices, watching valleys like mourning deities. Why entomb the dead beyond reach? To shield them. Or us? Perhaps they believed spirits needed height to soar. In life, the Chachapoya chose the precipice, shunning gentle valleys for thin air and steep stone, each block hauled into place with relentless resolve. Their cities, a testament to a people who danced on the edge of the possible. Their settlements were crafted less for ease than for defiance. Yet they spoke little of themselves. No writing, no grand epics, no carved chronicles. The Cloud People left not history, but architecture and shadows, and those shadows, predictably, guard their secrets. When the Inca folded the Chachapoya into their empire, they noted their pale skin and tall frames, a detail twisted by those chasing wild theories, claiming they were ancient Europeans, Celts, or even Atlanteans. All baseless. The truth is richer. They were native Andeans, masters of vertical existence. Their bodies adapted to the heights, but their culture crumbled under conquest. The Inca uprooted them, scattered them, and filled their cities with loyalists. Then the Spanish arrived, erasing the remnants with disease, forced faith, and Europe's ruthless oblivion. No rebellion is recorded, no saga of resistance preserved, just silence. Yet Quilap endures. Its cliff tombs still loom, its sarcophagi still gaze from the stone. What kind of people build citadels among clouds? Those with something to guard, or to hide, perhaps both. Recent digs at Chachapoya sites reveal not just homes, but ceremonial platforms, stones etched with abstract symbols and traces of advanced farming. These were no desperate cliff dwellers. They were engineers, planners, builders who made gravity seem negotiable. Why there? Some say the heights offered strategic views. Others claim spiritual proximity to the sky. Some whisper of isolation. The higher you climb, the harder you are to conquer. Yet conquerors came. The Inca prevailed. The Spanish completed the erasure. Perhaps Quilap and its sister sites were final strongholds. Last stands against a tightening world. Or maybe the Chachapoya knew their era was fading. Perhaps their obsession with height wasn't about defense, but departure. They're dead, placed in unreachable niches, seem poised, not for rest, but for ascent, as if awaiting a celestial call. Their cities weren't shelters. They were thresholds, bridges between earth and sky, stand amid Quilap's fog-wrapped ruins, and it feels less like a city, more like a memory teetering between staying and vanishing, rediscovered only in the 19th and 20th centuries. The Chachapoya were nearly forgotten, their names erased, their mummies hidden, their temples reclaimed by vines. Without stubborn archaeologists and landslides exposing tombs, they'd remain a whisper. This leads us to another lost culture, older and more obscured, from prehistoric Nigeria, crafting surreal terracotta heads with a near-modern flair, then vanishing without a trace. But another African enigma awaits beyond Nok, a Sahel kingdom that tunneled beneath the earth to reach hidden waters. One that flourished in a place no one should have survived. Then it was consumed by sand, by empire, by time. The Garamantes, Picture the Sahara Desert not as it is now, but as it was once. A shifting expanse of rock and sand, blistering by day, freezing by night, as inhospitable to human ambition as the surface of Mars, a place where no civilization should thrive, a graveyard of heat and wind. Now imagine that under this hellscape, a kingdom flourished underground, out of sight, out of reach, not myth, not mirage, real. The Garamantes. You've probably never heard of them. That's how they liked it. They lived where no one else dared to, and they engineered the impossible underground water system that kept an empire alive in the middle of the world's largest desert. Then, like so many others, they vanished. Not with a scream, but with a shrug. The Garamantes rose to power in what is now southwest Libya, in the Fezzan region, one of the most brutal places on Earth. They began as semi-nomadic pastoralists around 1000 before Common Era. But by the 5th century before Common Era, they had evolved into a complex society. They built towns, fortified settlements, necropolises. They farmed dates, wheat, barley, even grapes, all in the middle of a desert where rainfall is a rumor. How they went underground. The Garamantes developed a system of foggara, underground tunnels used to tap into ancient fossil water trapped beneath the desert. These channels, sometimes stretching for kilometers, allowed water to flow by gravity. To their fields, it was quiet, ingenious, invisible. They built life where life shouldn't be, and they did it in secret. The Romans knew of them barely. They show up in scattered texts. Herodotus called them a very great nation. Tacitus described them as elusive raiders. The Garamantes were known more for their speed than their substance. They rode chariots, pulled by horses across open sand, striking from nowhere, vanishing into heat. To the Romans, they were shadows on the horizon, ghosts with spears. But the truth was stranger. The Garamantes weren't just desert pirates. They were builders, traders, innovators. Archaeological digs in the Fezzan have uncovered multi-room houses, urban layouts, cemeteries, even what appears to be a palace. The capital, Jerma, modern-day Jerma, may have housed 4,000 people with 6,000 more in surrounding settlements. That may sound small, but in the Sahara, that's a metropolis. And they weren't isolated. They traded across vast distances. Gold, salt, slaves, ivory, serving as middlemen between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world. They weren't the end of the road. They were the artery. Then, sometime around the 5th century Common Era, they were gone. Not conquered, not memorialized, just gone. What happened? The usual suspects line up. Climate change, overuse of resources, political fragmentation, Islam's expansion, disrupting trade routes. But at the core of it all was their dependence on a resource that couldn't replenish: fossil water. Once the underground aquifers dried up, the foggara failed. The fields went, the people fled. Imagine a kingdom drinking itself out of existence one bucket at a time. There's something brutally poetic about that. The desert didn't kill the Garamantes. The desert waited, let them flourish, let them innovate, then reclaim them. Today, the foggara are mostly collapsed. The walls of Jerma are sand-softened outlines. The stones whisper. Instead of speak, satellite imagery has revealed the bones of their kingdom-forgotten fields. Dead canals, tombs swallowed by dunes. Even their writing, Tifana, the ancient Berber script, survives only in fragments, inscriptions on rocks, names without stories, a language that tells us they were literate, but not what they said. And yet the Garamantes matter because they represent something we pretend we've conquered: limits. Modernity teaches us that if we build clever enough systems, we can outwit geography. The Garamantes were proof of that until they weren't, until nature reminded them, and now us, that engineering isn't immunity, that even the most ingenious solutions can run dry. We like to think of the desert as a place of emptiness. The Garamantes knew better. They filled it with life. Crete life. Life beneath the surface. Life that didn't need monuments or headlines. And maybe that's why they were forgotten. They didn't make a spectacle of themselves. They didn't broadcast their greatness. They survived by hiding until there was nothing left to hide from. And what's left now? Not much. Some pottery, stone tools, the remains of water channels, ruins half buried in the sand. There's no grand finale, no climactic fall, just evaporation, a slow fading. You could stand in the center of Germa today and never know you were in the heart of a kingdom, unless you dig. And that's the recurring theme, isn't it? These civilizations that disappear, they don't always fall. They don't always die. Sometimes they just get buried by time, by sand, by our obsession with bigger, louder, bludia, empires. But the silence matters. The Garamantes didn't write epics. They engineered survival. And when their survival failed, they didn't cry for help. They didn't demand remembrance. They simply stopped. And that leaves us with the image of a kingdom underground. Not just in tunnels, but in memory, a people who once lived in the hollow places of the earth, now living in the hollow places of our history. But not every disappearance is slow. Some come like lightning, like betrayal, like a cosmic joke. Let's move now to the far reaches of the Mediterranean, where another civilization famed for its art, architecture, and mystery seemed poised to shape the ancient world. Then the sea turned against them. The earth shook, and their story ended in fire and ash. The Minoans, the people of the labyrinth, of the bull, of the great silence. The Minoans, you've seen the imagery, even if you didn't know what it was. A sinuous figure in a flowing robe, mid-leap, flipping over the back of a bull. Frescoes painted in colors that still look wet. Dolphins swimming across palace walls. Spirals, lilies, griffins. A world where myth wasn't decoration. It was design, where art wasn't about conquest. It was about life. This was Minoan Crete, a civilization so sophisticated, so vibrant, so modern in its sensibilities, that when it was first uncovered, scholars couldn't believe. It was ancient, it looked too alive, too gentle. And then it was gone, vanished like a stage play, where all the actors forgot their lines. And the curtain never fell because no one remembered to lower it. The Minoans flourished on Crete for over 1,000 years, from around 2,700 before Common Era to 1,450 before Common Era. They weren't a small tribe huddled on a rock. They were a maritime powerhouse with a sprawling trade network, complex bureaucracy, and a cultural influence that stretched across the Aegean and beyond. Their cities were marvels, Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, labyrinthine layouts, sophisticated plumbing, multi-story buildings with light wells and ventilation shafts, murals that celebrated nature, not warfare, and yet they left behind no known monuments to military glory, no war propaganda, no records of conquest, just frescoes of dancing girls, fishermen, and religious rites. And a script, linear A, that we still can't read. It's hard to say whether the Minoans were peaceful or just unrecorded in their violence, but compared to their contemporaries, they seemed quieter, more playful, almost utopian. That's what makes their disappearance feel like a moral parable. Around 1,450, before Common Era, something changed. The palaces were destroyed. Not all at once, but in a rolling wave of collapse, fires, ruins, abandonment. The art stopped. The writing stopped. And when the dust settled, the island didn't belong to the Minoans anymore. It belonged to the Mycenaeans. Now, here's where things get murky. Was it war? Maybe. Some think the Mycenaeans invaded and burned the palaces. Others say there's little evidence of direct conflict, that the Minoans were already weakened, and the Mycenaeans just filled a vacuum. Then there's the theory that refuses to go away. Santorini Thera, the volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Santorini. Ancient Thera, estimated to have occurred around 1600 before Common Era, one of the largest eruptions in recorded history. It blew the island apart, sending tsunamis across the Aegean and possibly triggering climate disruptions across the region. The Minoans weren't on Thera, but they traded with it and were close enough to suffer the aftershocks. A tsunami could have decimated their coastal cities. Ashfall could have poisoned their crops. The psychological impact alone, an entire island obliterated, might have shattered their religious or political order. But the timing doesn't quite line up. Thera exploded decades before the final destruction of the Minoan palaces. That's led some to argue that Thera was the beginning of the end, not the end itself, a cultural trauma so profound. It started a slow unraveling, panic, decline, fragmentation, and eventually collapse. If so, it was the cruelest kind of apocalypse, the kind that lets you linger, hollowed out, for just long enough to see yourself fade, and fade they did. By the time the Mycenaeans took over Crete, Minoan culture was already disintegrating. Linear A gave way to Linear B, a script we can read, used by the Mycenaeans to record economic transactions, not myths. The frescoes changed, the language changed, the gods changed, the silence began. And here's the strangest part. The Minoans never told us their story. Not really. We know them only through archaeology, through ruins and guesses. They didn't leave behind readable histories. They didn't mythologize their kings. They didn't even seem to care about being remembered. Or maybe they thought they would be remembered, that the vibrancy of their art, the rhythm of their rituals, the complexity of their architecture would speak for them forever. But history doesn't listen unless you shout, and the Minoans didn't shout. They sang, danced, painted, and then fell silent. The Greeks who came after remembered them only through myth, Daedalus and the Labyrinth, Minos and the Minotaur, Ariadne and her thread, tales of half-human beasts, lost children, inescapable mazes. Those stories aren't historical accounts. They're echoes, dream versions of a people who left no message, only motifs. Knossos is often called the labyrinth, but it wasn't a maze. It was a palace, multi-leveled, disorienting, alive with frescoes and columns painted blood red. The so-called throne room contains a stone seat barely wider than a child's shoulders, the throne of a king, or the seat of a priestess, a ritual object, a joke we were never meant to get. No one knows, because the people who could explain it never wrote it down, or if they did, they used a language the earth hasn't yet agreed to translate. What kind of civilization builds beauty but not memory? What kind of people leaves behind murals of dolphins and flowers, but no tombs, no funerary pyramids, no cries for legacy? Maybe the Minoans believed that beauty was enough, that the gods saw, even if history didn't, or maybe they thought they had more time. It's easy to mourn a civilization that dies in fire. It's harder to grieve one that fades with grace. The Minoans didn't rage. They didn't resist. They let go, and in letting go, they became a riddle wrapped in art. But let's follow that volcanic trail just a little farther. Because while the Minoans were vanishing in the eastern Mediterranean, another group of enigmatic seafarers was setting fire to the entire Bronze Age, a shadow army with no home, no face, no king. They attacked Egypt. They burned Troy. They brought apocalypse in their sails. No one knows where they came from. We just called them the Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples. They came from nowhere. That's the part that keeps historians up at night. No warning, no declarations, no heralds announcing the dawn of a new power, just ships, hundreds of them, pulling up to the shores of the mightiest civilizations of the late Bronze Age, carrying warriors with no fixed identity, no known language, no diplomatic envoy, and fire. They didn't conquer, they didn't occupy, they obliterated. Egypt called them the Sea Peoples. That's not a name. It's a shrug, a placeholder, a grim guess from pharaohs who couldn't explain why every one of their trade partners, neighbors, and tributaries was suddenly burning from the inside out. The Sea Peoples were not a single culture. They were a collapse in motion, a mobile catastrophe. They appeared around the 13th century before Common Era, and within a few short decades, ended the known world. No, exaggeration. This wasn't just the fall of a few cities. This was the apocalypse of an age. Hattusa, capital of the Hittite Empire, razed. Ugarit, a major trade hub, gone. Letters still on the desks, asking for help. Mycenaean Greece, burned, emptied. Culture erased. Cyprus, devastated. Canaan, Torchet. Even mighty Egypt barely held them off. And only after multiple invasions, Pharaoh Ramesses III defeated them in a naval battle, so vicious he had it carved into the walls of his temple at Medinet Habu, along with images of the enemy, helmeted warriors, ox-drawn carts, families in tow. This wasn't just an army. It was a migration with teeth. Who were they? No one knows. And not in a fun Indiana Jones way. Truly, no one knows. Theories abound, all of them contradictory, all of them plausible, and all of them maddeningly incomplete. Some say they were displaced populations from the Aegean, refugees turned raiders after natural disasters and internal collapse. Others suggest they were mercenaries or former allies betrayed by the very empires they once served. There's evidence that parts of the group may have been from Sardinia, Sicily, even the Balkans. Egyptian records list their names: the Shurden, the Shekelash, the Peliset, the Luca. Those are just sounds to us now, stripped of context, meaning nothing without maps that no longer exist. What united them wasn't culture, but momentum. They didn't settle lands. They erased them. They didn't send emissaries. They sent fire. Entire cities vanished from history during the period of their onslaught. Trade routes ended. Writing systems died. Language disappeared. Economies turned to dust. The late Bronze Age world was a delicate machine. Vast, interconnected, codependent. It was globalized. In its way, kings sent letters across continents. Merchants shipped tin and copper to make bronze. Palaces depended on distant resources. Empires were fragile, powerful, but fragile. And the Sea Peoples didn't just kick the machine, they dismantled it. What followed was centuries of darkness. No more trade. No more international diplomacy. The fall of Mycenae meant the Greeks had to start over. The collapse of the Hittites left a vacuum in Anatolia. The disintegration of Canaan opened the door for the rise of new powers, including Israel. The Sea Peoples didn't just end an age. They made the next one possible through absence. And yet, for all their destruction, they left nothing behind. No monuments, no written language, no ruins of their own, only ruins of others. Their legacy is the charred silhouette of someone else's greatness. That's why they're a paradox. They were everywhere, and now they're nowhere. They haunt inscriptions. They live in the gaps between clay tablets. They echo in the emptiness of once great cities. But they themselves have no center, no origin story. No phase. We remember them only because they ended. The people we can remember. In that way, they're like an ancient algorithm of entropy. A corrección, a reset button, a reminder that civilization is not a ladder, it's a circle. And sometimes it catches fire. The modern mind wants to understand them, to classify, to solve, but there's no solving the Sea Peoples. They were a force of historical entropy, not a puzzle with clean edges. Maybe they were a response to famine, drought, or climate change. Maybe they were the product of collapsed societies, banding together in desperation. Or maybe they were just tired of being ruled and decided to see what would happen if they ended the game. Their legacy, if you can call it that, is a question. Can a people be remembered solely through the absence they leave behind? And speaking of absences, Let's move from the sea to the highlands, to a kingdom that built a city of stones so massive and precisely fitted, they seem to defy gravity and logic. A civilization that predates Inca grandeur, whose walls still stand in perfect silence. No mortar, no writing, no screams, just fitted silence. They were called the builders of Sacsayhuaman. The unknown builders of Sacsayhuaman. There are walls that protect, there are walls that divide, and then there are walls that ask questions. Just by existing, Sacsayhuaman is one of those high above the city of Cusco in Peru, where the air thins and time distorts, lies a fortress, or maybe not a fortress, built from stones so massive and precisely cut that they've become a kind of architectural riddle. They slot together without mortar, with seams so tight that modern engineers still struggle to explain how they were carved, moved, and placed. Some stones weigh more than 100 tons. The largest are taller than a man, and shaped like irregular puzzle pieces. No two are the same. No repetition. No marking for error. The walls zigzag like a lightning bolt, frozen in stone. They don't just hold ground, they hold memory. We credit the Inca. That's the default. The Inca ruled the region before the Spanish arrived, but even the Inca, when asked how these walls were made, pointed backward to a time before them, to someone else. They inherited the stones, they didn't claim to have placed them, and that's where the mystery begins. Because the Inca built a lot roads, temples, administrative centers, but nothing quite like this. Nothing with this scale of precision. Nothing with stones this big. You don't lift a 100-ton boulder and shape it to fit its neighbors like a glove without serious technology or an incredible amount of time and labor, or both. So, who built Sacsayhuaman? We don't know, and we're not even sure when. The structure is so complex and the archaeological evidence so sparse that it's impossible to date precisely. Some estimates place its origins as early as 1100 Common Era. Others push it further, back, far further. But without written records or definitive radiocarbon data from the stones themselves, all we have are educated guesses and slowly accumulating doubts. The site covers over 3,000 hectares. Its terraces are arranged in 3 massive layers, forming a serpentine pattern that some say mimics lightning, others say mimics pumas, and still others claim is just coincidence. Theories range from fortress to ceremonial center to astronomical observatory to symbolic guardian of Cusco, the Inca capital, just downhill. But here's the catch. Much of what Sacsayhuaman was is gone. After the Spanish conquest, much of the upper structure, temples, towers, finer buildings was dismantled and carted off to build colonial Cusco. What remains are the foundations, the bones, the parts too big to move, the silent proof of an ambition we still don't fully comprehend. There's a violence to the silence at Sacsayhuaman. You stand before the walls, and you don't just feel small. You feel outmatched by technique, by intention, by the sheer physics of it all. The stones aren't just fitted, they're shaped to match each other with flowing, interlocking precision. Not flat, not stacked, melded. You could run a knife along the seam, and it wouldn't find a crack. Some stones have 12, 13 angles, no two matching. Others curve slightly, as if melted and molded. But there's no evidence of that. No scorch marks, no residue of heat, just craftsmanship so advanced it borders on alien. There are no tool marks, no blueprints, no inscriptions, just stones placed in patterns that seem mathematical, deliberate, but without any known formula. You don't build something like that by accident, and you don't build it for no reason. But the purpose remains unclear. Defensive, ceremonial, spiritual, all three, none. The zigzagging walls suggest fortification, but if this was a fortress, it was also a work of art. A fortress with flair, a stronghold that smiled. Some researchers propose acoustic properties, structures that could carry sound or music. Others point to astronomical alignments, saying the walls track solstices or constellations. But nothing has been conclusively proven. The absence of writing doesn't help. The Inca used quippus, knotted strings, as a system of record-keeping, but their full linguistic function is still largely undeciphered. Whatever deeper symbolic meaning was encoded in the design of Sacsayhuaman, it was likely never written down, or if it was destroyed. Which brings us back to the Inca themselves. They did build here, they honored the site, they expanded it, but even they, engineers in their own right, masters of the mountains, seemed to treat Sacsayhuaman with a kind of reverence, like it wasn't entirely theirs, like they were continuing something rather than beginning it. That's a pattern we've seen before. Civilizations inheriting ruins and treating them like sacred artifacts. The Egyptians building atop older sites. The Greeks reusing Mycenaean stones. The Romans integrating Etruscan temples. But what if that inheritance goes back even further? What if some ruins are so old they don't belong to any known culture? Alternative theorists, the ones academic archaeologists, roll their eyes at, suggest Sacsayhuaman may predate the Inca by millennia, that it's a fragment of a lost pre-Andean civilization, that perhaps we're looking at a site built in deep antiquity and simply reused by later peoples. It's speculative, but when the stones won't speak, speculation is all we have. And let's not forget the stories. The Inca spoke of Viracocha, the great creator god, a bringer of civilization who emerged from Lake Titicaca, traveled across the land, and vanished into the Pacific. He was said to have taught stoneworking and order before disappearing. In oral traditions, Viracocha isn't just a god, he's a memory, a placeholder for knowledge no longer understood. It's tempting to see him in the stones of Sacsayhuaman, not as a deity, but as a symbol of a forgotten builder, a forgotten age, a forgotten method, because someone built this, and they did it on purpose. And then, as always, the silence followed. Today, Sacsayhuaman is a tourist site. People take selfies next to the 12-angled stone, marvel at the tight seams, and leave, but the walls stay, watching, enduring, refusing to explain. The stones don't care if we understand. They never did, but not far from here. On a completely different continent, there's another enigma, one that stretches across what is now the southeastern United States, a sprawling city with pyramids, plazas, and a culture no one talks about. They called it Cahokia, a city that rivaled medieval London, filled with ritual, violence, order, and a silence so complete, it's almost surgical. The Mississippians of Cahokia, before New York, before Washington, before Boston and Philadelphia, and anything that could reasonably be called America, there was a city near the banks of the Mississippi River. It had pyramids, roads, a wooden wall, taller than most European houses. It had plazas large enough for thousands to gather, observatories made of timbers, aligned with the solstices, ceremonies that probably bled into violence, and a population that at its peak may have rivaled that of 12th century London. But you weren't taught this in school. This was Cahokia, the largest city north of Mexico, before the arrival of Europeans. It sprawled across what is now Illinois, right outside modern-day state Louis. If you drive past it today, you might miss it. The land looks like gentle hills, unusually symmetrical mounds of earth, nothing flashy, nothing demanding. That's how a ghost city hides in plain sight. Cahokia was built by the Mississippian culture, a society that began rising around 800 Common Era and reached its peak between 1050 and 1200 Common Era. At its height, the city may have held 15,000 to 20,000 people, with even more in surrounding satellite communities, numbers that place it among the largest urban centers in the world at the time. But unlike London or Paris, Cahokia didn't grow out of medieval ambition. It grew out of earth. The centerpiece of Cahokia is Monk's Mound, a massive earthen pyramid over 100 feet high and covering 14 acres at its base. It's still the largest pre-Columbian earthwork in the Americas. It took millions of baskets of soil to build, layer by layer, over generations. No stone, no metal tools, no beasts of burden, just will. We have no written record from Cahokia. The Mississippians had no writing system. We know of no books, no glyphs, only their earthworks, artifacts, and bones. So we piece together their story from patterned settlement layouts, burial customs, tool types, pottery shards. It's a puzzle where most of the pieces are dirt, and yet the picture that emerges is staggering. Cahokia wasn't just a city. It was cosmology, made physical, a planned layout, a spiritual blueprint rendered in soil and sweat. The plazas were laid out on cardinal directions. The city was aligned with celestial events. One site, now called Woodhenge, consisted of large timber posts arranged in a circle that marked the solstices and equinoxes. It was a calendar, a temple, and likely a stage for spectacle. This wasn't random settlement. It was ritualized space. A city built not just to house people, but to express a worldview. And then, suddenly, that world was gone. By the mid-1300s, Cahokia was abandoned. Its mounds left to the elements. The plazas grew weeds. The rituals ceased. The people gone. No mass graves. No obvious war. No invasion. Just absence. Why, theories abound. Environmental collapse is a favorite. Deforestation, soil depletion, floods from the overuse of the land surrounding the Mississippi floodplain, climate instability, disease. Some archaeologists point to social unrest, the breakdown of political or religious authority, others to overpopulation. Or maybe Cahokia simply couldn't sustain the weight of its own structure, like a dream too heavy to hold. But the real mystery isn't just why it collapsed, it's how completely it was forgotten. When European settlers arrived centuries later, they found the mounds, but had no idea what they were. Some thought they were natural hills. Others claimed the work of lost tribes, Phoenicians, Atlanteans, Welshmen, anything but Native Americans, anything but the truth. The myth of the vanishing Indian was easier to swallow than the idea of indigenous cities, indigenous architects, indigenous astronomers. So, Cahokia was edited out of the American story, buried under highways, cornfields, and cultural amnesia. And yet, Cahokia remains. Monk's Mound still rises from the earth, stubborn and silent. Archaeologists have unearthed clues, ceremonial copper, finely crafted shell beads, the remains of human sacrifices, young women buried without ceremony, lined up like offerings. They found mass graves, signs of elite privilege, and brutal hierarchy. Evidence that Cahokia, for all its grandeur, was also a city built on control. There are signs of walls being built around certain neighborhoods' palisades, wooden fortifications, enclosing the central mounds and plazas. This wasn't just a ceremonial site. It was political, possibly oppressive. Cahokia's rulers, whoever they were, commanded enormous labor forces. They orchestrated large-scale events. Some believe Monk's Mound itself may have been the seat of a theocratic ruler, a priest-king, or a council of spiritual elites. Whatever the truth, it wasn't egalitarian. The remains tell us that, and maybe that's part of why it vanished. If the social contract breaks, if the faith in your ruler or your gods disintegrates, what happens to the city built in their name? Maybe Cahokia didn't collapse in a single event. Maybe it bled out. Rituals faltered. Crops failed. The people drifted away, took their stories with them, and the silence grew. Today, the site is protected, but barely. Monk's Mound sits next to highways, shopping centers, and warehouses. The ghosts live in the shadows of semis and parking lots. Most Americans have never heard of it. We remember Roanoke, where 115 people vanished, but we forget Cahokia, where 20,000 lived and left no message, because Cahokia wasn't lost. it was ignored. That's the thread running through all these vanished civilizations. Not just the act of disappearance, but the response to it, the silence afterward, the way memory unravels. Not through destruction, but disinterest. And speaking of silence, let's head east again, back across the Atlantic to the Balkan Hills, to a culture older than Sumer, one that built homes, cities, entire societies, and then deliberately destroyed them. We're going back, before writing to a mystery. Even archaeologists don't like to talk about the Vinci. They left behind a script, maybe, or a hoax, or a warning. No one knows. The Vinci culture, before Babylon, before Egypt, before writing, had rules. There was something strange happening in the Balkans. A culture began to emerge, not flashy, not imperial, not defined by war or monuments, but by pattern, rhythm, pottery, so precise it bordered on obsession. Homes arranged with suspicious uniformity and artifacts etched with symbols that no one could quite decipher. Even today, this was the Vinci culture, sometimes called Old Europe's first civilization, and like a ghostwriter who never finished the book, they left behind only half a language, half a story, and a silence that stretches deeper than most ruins dare to go. The Vinci people lived from around 5,700 to 4,500 before Common Era, centered in what is now Serbia and parts of Romania, Bulgaria, and Bosnia. They built some of the earliest known permanent settlements in Europe, villages with grid-like layouts, multi-room homes, ovens, wells, even furniture carved from clay. These weren't mud huts in the wilderness. These were blueprints. They worked copper before the so-called Copper Age. They traded across regions. They mass-produced pottery with designs that could pass for modern minimalist art. And they left behind over 700 known symbols scratched, painted, or impressed into pottery, figurines, and spindle whorls. Not random marks, not doodles, symbols structured, repeating, systematic. It has the flavor of writing, but it isn't. Or maybe it was, and we simply never found enough of it. Or maybe it was something else, entire ritual language, mnemonic code, proto-script, proto-propaganda. Whatever it was, we call it the Vinci symbols. But they've never been deciphered, and they might never be, because the Vinci didn't leave us a Rosetta Stone. They didn't leave tombs or kings or statues of themselves flexing over battlefields. They left objects, figurines, ceramics, carved tools, each with careful, often repeated etchings, patterns, dots, crosses, inverted triangles. Some of them look almost absurdly contemporary, like alien emojis scratched onto clay. And that has predictably driven people off the cliff of speculation. Some say the Vinci script is the oldest writing system in the world, predating Sumerian cuneiform by over 1,000 years. Others claim it's not writing at all, but a kind of symbolic shorthand for religious or domestic purposes. Then, there's the fringe crowd, linking Vinci to ancient aliens, Atlantean diaspora, or forgotten science, because of course they do. But here's what we do know. The Vinci built large, stable settlements, some with populations that may have reached several thousand people. They were peaceful. No weapons found in graves. No evidence of warfare. No signs of hierarchical control or elite classes. Their homes were equal in size, evenly spaced. It wasn't paradise, but it was balanced. And then, around 4,500 before Common Era, it ended, not with fire, not with an invasion, but with a disappearance. The settlements were abandoned, the culture unraveled, and the symbols stopped. No records, no migration trails, no successor civilization preserving their legacy. Just the silence of people who may have gotten too comfortable or too static or simply too human. One theory suggests they ran out of arable land. Another, that their agricultural practices depleted the soil. Others blame climate shifts or the arrival of more aggressive, warlike tribes from the Eurasian steppes. But the truth is, no one really knows. What's left behind are the fragments of an intelligence we don't recognize, a culture that felt deeply organized but never bothered to explain itself to the future. That's the thing about the Vinci. They weren't trying to be remembered, or maybe they thought they didn't need to be. Maybe they thought the patterns were enough, that the symbols would outlive explanation, that form was meaning, or maybe they thought we'd get it eventually, that the signs would click into place, and the spiral would reveal its center. But we haven't, and every year that passes makes it less likely that we will. Archaeologists argue over whether the Vinci symbols constitute writing. They throw words around like semiotic system, or log cluster, or protoscript. But none of those terms answer the central question: what were they trying to say? Because you don't carve hundreds of symbols across centuries, across dozens of sites, unless you're trying to say something. Maybe it was religion. Maybe it was law. Maybe it was as mundane as this pot belongs to Vojislav. Maybe it was poetry. Or maybe it was silence, masquerading as language, a ritual system designed not to inform, but to transform, to anchor the invisible into the visible. And then, when the ritual lost its power, so did the symbols. The Vinci are rarely discussed in textbooks. They don't make it into school curriculums. Their cities weren't made of stone. Their gods weren't anthropomorphized. Their legacy isn't conquest. It's confusion, which is maybe the most honest legacy a civilization can leave. Because every written language we now understand was once an indecipherable code. Every culture we now venerate was once an unsolved mystery. The only difference is we cracked some of the codes. We haven't cracked the Vinci, not yet. And maybe we never will. So what do you do with a culture that built no monuments, fought no wars, wrote symbols no one can read, and then disappeared without leaving so much as a farewell note? You do what the Vinci themselves did. You observe the pattern, and you wait, because silence is still a form of communication. And speaking of silence, that might not be what it seems. There's another culture, much more recent, that seems to have followed a similar rhythm. They built a vast trade empire, carved tombs into cliffs, constructed a rose-red city in the desert, and then ghosted the world. But we've already met them once, haven't we? So let's go deeper into that red stone. Let's look not just at what they built, but how they disappeared. The Nabateans revisited. You already know the view. You've seen it in postcards, documentaries, and Indiana Jones movies. A narrow gorge opens up into sunlight. Sandstone cliffs blush red, gold, rose, and out of the rock itself, a temple emerges, not built, but carved, like a revelation frozen in stone. Al-Khasne, the treasury. Petra. But here's the part that keeps slipping through the cracks. No one was home. The city was empty when it was found. No kings, no courts, no scribes, no stories. The Nabateans, the masters of Petra, left behind architecture, but not autobiography. And that absence is the loudest thing they ever said. We talked about the Nabateans before. Their desert hydrology, their surreal architecture, their sudden disappearance. But the surface facts don't do justice to just how strange it all is. Because this wasn't some obscure backwater tribe, the Nabateans were a powerhouse. From the 4th century before Common Era to the 2nd century Common Era, they controlled one of the most lucrative trade routes in the ancient world. Incense, spices, silk, ivory flowing from Arabia to the Mediterranean. Petra was their jewel, carved into the cliffs of southern Jordan. But they had outposts stretching from Damascus to Medina. They weren't just wealthy, they were strategic. Their language was a dialect of Aramaic, but their culture was an alchemical blend: Arabic, Hellenistic, Egyptian, Mesopotamian. Their gods were a syncretic pantheon with familiar shapes but unfamiliar names. Their temples echoed Greek forms. But with desert logic, their inscriptions were few but precise. And then nothing. By the 4th century Common Era, the Nabateans had disappeared, not just faded, evaporated. Here's the thing that gets buried in textbooks. There was no great war, no dramatic conquest. The Romans annexed their territory in 106 Common Era, but it was almost peaceful. A bureaucratic takeover. The Nabateans were absorbed like a company being bought out. They didn't resist. They didn't rebel. They just left the stage. Petra itself declined slowly. Trade routes shifted. The Red Sea and the Persian Gulf became more profitable. Overland caravans lost relevance. Earthquakes did their part, and by the time Islamic expansion swept the region centuries later, the Nabateans had already become ghosts. But here's the twist. They left the set intact. Petra wasn't destroyed. It wasn't buried. It wasn't overrun by jungle or desert. It was preserved as if they planned their disappearance to be as aesthetically immaculate as their architecture. Imagine a civilization exiting history with a bow, quietly, elegantly. No, curtain call, just vacancy. Most civilizations die screaming. The Nabateans vanished in plain sight. And that's what makes them terrifying, because they had everything: trade, culture, architecture, innovation. They mastered water in the desert. They designed a city that looked like myth made manifest, and then they chose not to stay. We talk about collapse like it's always a tragedy. But what if this was something else? Not failure, not weakness, but completion. What if the Nabateans simply outgrew the game? They'd made their wealth. They'd built their monuments. They'd inscribed their secrets in sandstone. Maybe they realized that permanence isn't about legacy. It's about knowing when to vanish before history turns you into a ruin. We see Petra now and think of it as a tomb, a monument to a lost people. But what if it was never meant to be remembered that way? What if Petra was a ritual of forgetting? Think about the treasury's facade. Monumental, dramatic, theatrical. But behind it, a small room, no treasure, no throne, no grand narrative, just the echo of expectation, its performance architecture, a mask. Everything about Petra plays with illusion. Elaborate facades with minimal interiors, tombs made for the viewer, not the occupant. A city designed to impress, but not necessarily to explain. And that makes you wonder, were the Nabateans telling us something? Were they warning us that visibility isn't immortality, that you can build something magnificent and still vanish without a trace? Because here's the secret. Nobody likes to hear. Most civilizations aren't conquered. They're forgotten, and the Nabateans, in their eerie brilliance, might have been the first to understand that they didn't leave behind heroic epics. They didn't write manifestos. They didn't fight to be remembered. They built a city, made it breathtaking, and then walked away. And we still don't know why, but maybe they were part of a broader tradition. Ancient cultures who understood that disappearance isn't always a loss, that to vanish well might be the final act of control, the ultimate expression of power, because if no one knows your ending, you control the myth. And speaking of myths, let's talk about a different kind of disappearance, one that didn't happen in the desert, or the jungle, or the mountains, one that happened on an island isolated, remote, impossibly far from everywhere. An island with statues, hundreds of them, faces too big, eyes too wide, watching the sea. The people who carved them, gone. The trees gone, the meaning gone. We call it Easter Island. They called it Rapa Nui. Rapa Nui. The ocean doesn't like to give things back. It keeps what it takes. Secrets, ships, civilizations. And sometimes, what it leaves behind is more disturbing than what it swallows. Like Rapa Nui, a speck in the Pacific, a volcanic whisper, thousands of miles from anywhere. The last place you'd expect to find giants, and yet there they are. The Moai, stone faces, heavy-lidded, solemn, watching nothing, watching everything, carved from volcanic rock and placed along the coastline like sentinels guarding a story we forgot to read. There are nearly 900 of them. Some stand, some lie half-buried, some were abandoned mid-carve in the quarry. At Rano Raraku, all of them face inward, toward the island, toward the people who no longer understood why they were watching, because the people who carved the moai, the original Rapa Nui, disappeared. Not in the mythical sense, not in a single apocalyptic event, but in stages, like a slow-motion vanishing act. They arrived on the island around 1200 Common Era, navigating thousands of miles of open ocean in double-hulled canoes. They brought chickens, bananas, sweet potatoes, and a spiritual worldview carved into every stone they touched. And they thrived for a while. Rapa Nui is only about 63 square miles. Tiny, isolated, but the early inhabitants turned it into a kind of sacred blueprint. They divided the island into clan territories. They built ceremonial platforms called ahu, and they erected the moai massive stone heads with torsos buried in the earth, representing ancestral chiefs, spiritual conduits, divine lineage. This wasn't just art. It was belief scaled up to geological proportions. But then the forest disappeared. That's where the story fractures. Because by the time European explorers first reached Rapa Nui in the 18th century, the island was almost entirely deforested. No trees taller than shrubs. No canoes. No birds of flight. And the people fewer, divided, malnourished, stripped of memory. So what happened? The traditional narrative reads like a cautionary tale written by nature itself. The Rapa Nui, in their zeal to honor their ancestors, cut down their forests, primarily to transport the moai. They used logs as rollers, ropes, levers. It took an absurd amount of manpower and material to move even a single statue from quarry to ahu. And then one day, the trees were gone. No trees meant no canoes. No canoes meant no fishing. No fishing meant famine. Famine meant social collapse. Collapse meant war. War meant moai, no longer sacred, but toppled. This version of the story has become environmentalist gospel, a tragic lesson in ecological hubris. Jared Diamond canonized it in Collapse. The Rapa Nui overexploited their resources, and the island punished them. But it's not the whole story, and maybe not even the right one. More recent scholarship challenges the doomsday narrative. Some researchers argue that the island's decline didn't begin until after European contact, that rats, introduced by the first settlers, played a larger role in deforestation by eating seeds and preventing regrowth. That moai may have been walked upright, using rope and leverage, not rolled on timber. That the people of Rapa Nui adapted, innovated, survived longer and more cleverly than they've been given credit for. In this version, the real collapse begins after 1722, when Dutch explorers arrived and brought disease, slavery, and cultural erasure. By the 19th century, Peruvian slavers had abducted a large portion of the island's population. Missionaries arrived shortly after, converting and suppressing native customs. Oral traditions were rewritten, suppressed, or erased. Language was lost, rituals forbidden. By the time anthropologists showed up to ask questions, the answers were already gone. So, which story is true? Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe the tragedy of Rapa Nui isn't just about deforestation or colonialism. Maybe it's about what happens when meaning itself disappears. The moai are still here. They weigh tons. They dominate the landscape. But what they mean, we're not sure. Ancestor worship? Yes. But beyond that, were they all spiritual? Were they political? Were they monuments to peace or warnings of war? There are signs that competition between clans led to ever larger moai, an escalation of sacred one-upmanship. You raise a 20-footer, we'll raise a 30-footer, one-upmanship on a volcanic rock in the middle of the ocean. But eventually they stopped carving, stopped raising, stopped watching, Some moai were toppled intentionally. Others were just abandoned. What do you call a civilization that built its entire identity around memory, then forgot a place where every stone was sacred and every sacred object became a ruin? There are modern Rapa Nui people. Of course, descendants, survivors. And in recent years, there's been a revival, language reclamation, spiritual restoration, cultural pride. But the gap between now and then is wide because the silence didn't just fall, it was pushed by colonizers, by academics, by a Western world that looked at Rapa Nui and saw a mystery, not a memory. Today, tourists fly in, take selfies with the moai, and fly out. They marvel at the scale. They ponder the logistics. But very few ask the real question. Not how they moved the statues. Not why they were built. But what happens to a civilization that forgets what it was for? Because that's the horror of Rapa Nui. Not the collapse, but the disconnect. A people who built monuments to remember and then had to stare into the stone faces of their ancestors and whisper, "I don't know who you are anymore." And speaking of monuments with forgotten meaning, let's go back across the ocean, back to Nigeria, to a set of stone monoliths, some shaped like humans, others like phantoms that rise out of the earth in silence. A megalithic mystery, a spiritual cipher, a place no one wrote about, but someone clearly honored. The Ikam monoliths. In a quiet corner of southeastern Nigeria, nestled between thick forest and rolling earth, stand over 300 stones, weathered, vertical, mysterious. They rise from the soil, not in rows or grids, but in clusters, like a conversation frozen mid-sentence. Some are tall, others squat, some lean, some tilt, all of them carved, all of them silent. Welcome to Ikam, the Ikam monoliths, sometimes called the Akwanshi, meaning ancestors in stone, are scattered across more than 30 sites in the Cross River State, carved from volcanic basalt. Each one ranges from about 1 meter to 2 meters in height, but they feel taller, heavier, not because of their size, but because of what's not said about them. There are no texts, no origin story, no ancient scrolls describing why the stones were made or by whom. Oral traditions exist, vague, scattered, half-remembered tales that speak of ancestors, spirits, rites, but no firm chronology, no names, just the suggestion of reverence. Each stone is unique. Some have faces, bee eyes, open mouths, exaggerated features. Others show hands, weapons, breasts, genitalia. Still others are covered in strange geometric patterns, spirals, triangles, dots. They weren't just art, they were symbols. They meant something, but that meaning was never written down. And now it hovers like mist around the monoliths, haunting without resolving. Archaeologists estimate the stones could be between 200 to 1,500 years old, possibly even older. But the people who created them left no durable architecture, no metal, no known writing system. Just these stones, half human, half totem, standing like sentinels at the edge of memory, and that edge is crumbling. For decades, the monoliths were largely ignored by formal historians. They weren't grand enough. They didn't fit the clean timelines of African empires like Benin or Mali. And so, like many indigenous artifacts without an empire seal of approval, they were treated as curiosities rather than clues. But if you look closely, you start to see a pattern. The monoliths are often found near ancient village sites. They're clustered in areas that suggest territorial boundaries, ceremonial zones, or ritual gathering places. Some seem to mark graves. Others may have been used in fertility rites, social contracts, or initiation ceremonies. One theory suggests the stones were created by the Ikoi or Agwagun people, whose descendants still live in the region. Their traditional art wood carvings, body painting, facial scarification bears eerie resemblance to the features carved into the stones. Another theory links the monoliths to secret societies, closed circles of spiritual power and governance that dominated many West African cultures. These societies maintained balance, justice, ritual, and they used symbols. The stones may have been records, not written, but sculpted, histories of the living and the dead, contracts in stone, laws, lineages, blood-bound agreements, but again, no confirmation. No smoking chisel, just guesswork and granite. Some stones have been defaced, others stolen. A few ended up in foreign museums. Stripped of their context, others lie half-buried, eaten by moss, forgotten by the very villages that once may have revered them. Because the real disappearance here isn't the culture, it's the continuity. We know who lives in Cross River today. We know the languages they speak, the stories they tell, but somewhere between now and then, the translation broke down, the meaning behind the monoliths slipped through time's fingers, the chain of knowledge, handed down for generations, snapped, and the stones became strangers. It's the same story we've seen before, and we'll see again. People create meaning. They encode it into objects. Those objects outlast the people, and the meaning dies alone. The Ecom monoliths ask the same question as Göbekli Tepe, the Vinci symbols, the Moai of Rapa Nui. What do we do when we no longer understand the things we once believed in? Do we guess? Do we rebuild the rituals from fragments? Do we project our fears and fantasies onto them? Or do we let the silence speak for itself? There's a haunting possibility that the monoliths weren't meant to be understood forever, that they were made to mark a moment, an era, a belief, a pact that had an expiration date. And when that moment passed, the symbols calcified, no longer active, no longer relevant, just stone. But there's something powerful about the act of carving them in the first place. It takes effort to make a monument. It takes purpose. You don't chisel spirals and faces into rock unless you think someone or something is paying attention. Maybe the stones weren't for the living. Maybe they were for the ancestors, or the gods, or the earth, or the future. Or maybe, just maybe, they were for us. A message sent through time, encrypted in ignorance, a question that survives only because no one ever answered it. The monoliths of Ecom are not buried. They are standing, which makes them different from the ruins we usually discuss. They're still visible, still there, still asking, and in that visibility lies a different kind of haunting. Not what happened here, but why don't you know? Why didn't you ask sooner? Why didn't you listen longer? Why did you wait until the stone started to fade? And now, another stone, another forgotten kingdom. But this one didn't just leave behind monoliths. It left entire cities, carved into mountain cliffs, hidden among clouds, a place of mystery and engineering, shrouded in fog, and slowly being swallowed by jungle. We're going to Colombia now, to a city called Ciudad Perdida, the Lost City, a place so remote it was forgotten for 400 years, then rediscovered by looters who thought they'd found El Dorado, Ciudad Perdida. First, the stairs. That's how it begins. Not with a sign, not with a gate, but with an endless staircase. Stone steps cut into the Colombian jungle, climbing like a thought that doesn't want to finish itself. You hike for days through cloud forest, across rivers, over cliffs, dodging snakes and old ghosts, and then you reach it, Ciudad Perdida, the lost city, except it was never really lost, just left alone. Forgotten not by accident, but by neglect. And when you stand there, high in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, looking down at the moss-covered terraces and ceremonial platforms, one thing becomes very clear. This place was not meant to be easy to reach or easy to forget. Ciudad Perdida, also known as Tayuna, to the indigenous communities who still revere it, was once the heart of the Tairona civilization, a mountain-dwelling people who flourished in northern Colombia long before the Spanish arrived. It was likely built around 800 Common Era, centuries before Machu Picchu, and housed thousands of people at its peak, but you've probably never heard of it. That's not coincidence. That strategy? The jungle erases what the conquerors miss. The Tairona weren't empire builders. In the usual sense, they didn't leave behind massive armies or sprawling dominions. Instead, they built networks of settlements, of trade, of ritual. Their cities were carved into steep mountainsides, connected by stone roads and oriented toward rivers, spirits, and stars. Ciudad Perdida was the crown jewel, and when the conquistadors came, the Tairona vanished into the forest. They didn't meet the Spanish with open arms. They didn't roll over, they resisted, and then they disappeared. What was once a thriving city, built with astronomical precision, lined with gold offerings and sacred plazas, was swallowed by vegetation, cloud cover, and generational silence. By the 1600s, the Spanish weren't talking about the Tairona anymore. They were too busy building churches on top of native altars, rewriting history. One sermon at a time, the mountains grew quiet. For nearly 400 years, no outsider set eyes on Ciudad Perdida until 1972. That's when looters stumbled on the stone steps. They called it the Green Hell, a treasure hunter's fever dream. They weren't looking for culture, they were looking for gold. They found its ceremonial urns, pendants, figurines, and sold most of it on the black market. That's how the site was rediscovered, not by scholars, but by thieves. When archaeologists finally caught up, it was already too late to retrieve much of the original artifact context. But what remained, what still remains, is a city built not for defense, not for spectacle, but for alignment with nature, with time, with meaning. Ciudad Perdida consists of more than 170 stone terraces cut into the slope of the mountain, arranged in concentric platform, circular plazas, interconnected walkways, staircases that seem to lead everywhere and nowhere, water channels that still function, pathways that snake through jungle-like veins. There is no monumental temple, no royal palace, but there is order, and in that order, purpose. The Tairona believed in balance, harmony with the environment. They worked with the land, not against it. Their cities were designed to coexist, not conquer. And maybe that's why they vanished so effectively. Because disappearing was the one thing they'd always been good at. They didn't get eradicated, they got invisible. Today, descendants of the Tairona the Kogi, Viva, Arhuaco, and Canquamo still live in the region. They walk the same paths, perform the same rituals, speak to the same spirits. They say Ciudad Perdida was never lost. It was simply waiting. They call it Teyuna, and for them, it was always sacred. To outsiders, it's a marvel. To the descendants, it's home. And that creates a strange tension, because now the site is open to tourists' guided treks through the jungle, photo ops on moss-covered stones, the Indiana Jones experience for backpackers with decent boots and questionable intentions. But the locals warn, this isn't just archaeology, it's memory, and memory doesn't like to be disturbed. Archaeologists believe the Tairona abandoned Ciudad Perdida during the 16th century. In the wake of colonial violence, disease, enslavement, cultural devastation. But there's no massacre lair, no siege remnants, no written record of a fall. The city wasn't burned or destroyed. It was walked away from, like a song that ends mid-note, like a story that gets too painful to finish. Some say the priests knew it was over, that the city couldn't be saved, but the meaning could. So, they took what they could, buried what they couldn't, and faded back into the forest to preserve the ritual. If not the stone, the Kogi elders still talk about balance, about the younger brothers of the world, us who've forgotten how to live in harmony with the earth. They say the mountain cities were built to keep the world in balance, and now that balance is gone. They didn't build Ciudad Perdida to last forever. They built it to remind us, but we forgot. Anyway, now the jungle tries to hold the city close. Every year, the plants reclaim more, The moss gets thicker, the paths narrow. Nature is not impressed by legacy. It doesn't care if we forget. The stairs will still be there, leading nowhere, leading everywhere. Ciudad Perdida is not just a city, it's a haunting, not of ghosts, but of what we should have known, of how to live without walls, of how to disappear without destruction. And that brings us naturally to one last twist of irony. Because as the Tirona were vanishing into the mist, another civilization was building something entirely different. Not balance, not memory, but obsession. A culture in West Africa that built stone cities in the grasslands, trade centers, complex bureaucracy, fortress. And then, when empires rose and new borders were drawn, it was left behind. We're going to Zimbabwe now, to a place the colonists tried to deny was even African. Great Zimbabwe, in the heart of southern Africa, where the savanna stretches wide and gold veins run deep beneath the soil, there stands a ruin too monumental to ignore and too uncomfortable to accept. Its walls are vast, its architecture precise, its symbolism complex. It was a city built of stone, without mortar, without iron, without any help from Europe. Thank you very much. Its name, Great Zimbabwe. And for over 400 years, European colonists, missionaries, and even archaeologists did everything they could to insist it had nothing to do with black Africans. Because sometimes the most threatening thing in the world is proof that people you tried to erase were once extraordinary. Let's rewind. Great Zimbabwe was the capital of a powerful kingdom that thrived between the 11th and 15th centuries, Common Era. It sat at the center of a massive trade network that extended all the way to the Swahili coast, Arabia, India, and even China. Its people traded gold, ivory, and cattle in exchange for glass beads, ceramics, textiles. This wasn't some dusty tribal outpost. It was a player on the world stage. And its seat of power, a stone metropolis built in the heart of the bush, made with skill, labor, and intention. The city consists of 3 main zones. The Hill Complex, a sacred acropolis believed to be a royal or spiritual center. The Great Enclosure, with 11-meter-high walls and massive stone structures enclosing towers and ritual areas. The Valley Ruins, a sprawl of homes, workshops, and lower-class residences. In total, Great Zimbabwe may have supported 18,000 people at its peak. Let that number sit for a moment. That's not a village. That's not a shrine. That's a city. Its walls, especially in the Great Enclosure, were constructed using carefully cut granite blocks, stacked without mortar, in tight-fitting patterns that have withstood 6 centuries of weather and human tampering. The outer wall alone stretches over 800 feet in circumference. One tower inside it, called the Conical Tower, still defies clear interpretation. Granary, temple, monument. We don't know, and that, of course, is where the trouble started. When Europeans discovered Great Zimbabwe in the 19th century, already long abandoned, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Stone architecture in Africa, built by Africans. That didn't fit the colonial narrative, so they changed the story. Early European scholars claimed the site must have been built by foreigners, Phoenicians, Arabs, Egyptians, King Solomon's men, anyone but the ancestors of the local Shona people who had actually lived there. British archaeologist James Theodore Bent was sent in 1891 by Cecil Rhodes himself to confirm that Great Zimbabwe had non-African origins. Unsurprisingly, he obliged, proposing that the ruins were the work of ancient Semitic builders. And for decades, that was the official story, printed in textbooks, maps, and museum placards. But it was a lie. Later, more honest archaeologists, people like Gertrude Caton Thompson, proved conclusively in the 1920s and 1930s that Great Zimbabwe was built by indigenous Africans. The pottery, tools, cultural continuity with the Shona people, it was all there. undeniable. And yet, the lie persisted, because it's hard to dismantle a fantasy when that fantasy props up your power, even into the 20th century. White minority governments in what was then Rhodesia tried to suppress the truth about Great Zimbabwe. School children were taught the ruins were mysterious. African guides were discouraged from discussing their cultural heritage. Museums avoided uncomfortable facts, all because a stone city in the African interior was just a little too advanced for the story colonialism needed to tell. But here's the twist. The site was already abandoned by the time Europeans ever saw it. By around 1450, Great Zimbabwe had been vacated, the reasons still unclear: environmental decline, overgrazing, drought, shifts in trade routes, political upheaval, a combination of all the above, whatever the cause. The capital was relocated northward. The city crumbled slowly. The people moved on. The stones stayed, and in that stillness, in that quiet desertion, a space was created not just for ruin, but for invention. When a culture leaves no written records, others rush in to write the story for them with their own pen and their own agenda. But the Shona people never forgot. Even today, their oral traditions speak of the builders. They speak of the Mbira, the spiritual music that echoed in those stone walls, of ancestors who watched the trade caravans come and go, of a civilization that didn't need pyramids or papyrus to matter. The very name of the country, Zimbabwe, is derived from Zimbabwe, meaning houses of stone. It's a name reclaimed, a narrative rewritten from within, and the city itself still there. Still massive, still strange. The conical tower, the purpose of the great walls, the symbolism of the soapstone birds found on site, all remains unsettled, interpreted, reinterpreted, whispered about. And that's the thing. Great Zimbabwe doesn't just challenge colonial lies, it challenges our modern ones. To, like the lie that you need to write things down to be civilized, or the lie that memory only matters if it's exported, or the lie that greatness only counts if it was witnessed by outsiders. Great Zimbabwe was great without needing to explain itself, and in that quiet confidence, it joins the long list of civilizations that thrived without footnotes, collapsed without fanfare, and endured without permission. But let's move farther east now, into the Indian Ocean, to an island chain often remembered for its beaches, not its mystery. But beneath the palm trees and postcards lies a civilization that once built stone tombs, intricate rituals, and sprawling settlements, all swallowed by jungle and rewritten by empire. We're headed to the Maldives next, but not the one from the travel brochures. The Redden people say Maldives, and most people picture turquoise waters, overwater, bungalows, and infinity pools that stretch into forever. But that's today's illusion. Before the honeymooners, before the colonial flags, before the resort empires, there were the Redden, and they didn't come to relax. They came to build, and then they disappeared, scattered across the coral islands of the Maldives. Beneath layers of sand and roots lie ruins. No travel blogger ever. Photographs, ancient stone foundations, intricate burial, tombs, coral-stacked temples known as Havita, and inscriptions in a script no one bothered to keep alive. The official story of Maldivian history begins around the 3rd century before Common Era with Indo-Aryan settlers. Later came Islamic conversion in the 12th century, followed by Portuguese, Dutch, and British interference. Each colonial chapter footnoted and whitewashed for easy digestion. But before all of that, archaeological clues point to something stranger, something older. A culture that lived on these atolls before recorded memory. A people who carved out a life on islands barely wide enough for the tide to tolerate. A people some now call the Redden. That name isn't in textbooks. You won't find it in official chronologies. It survives mostly in fragmented legends, half-preserved stonework, Local whispers pass down in fishing villages and overlook shrine sites. The Redden, according to the tales, were powerful, mysterious, skilled in stonework despite living on an island chain with almost no indigenous stone. They carved coral instead dense, unforgiving fossilized coral. They built tombs, mosques, and circular shrines on raised platforms. Some of their structures suggest astronomical alignments, others are clearly ceremonial. A few are still standing, clinging to the edges of inhabited islands, like forgotten punctuation marks. No one knows exactly when the Redden lived. Estimates range from 1000 before Common Era to the early centuries of the Common Era. And what little we have is deeply inconsistent patchwork data from underwater archaeology, miscatalogued temple fragments, and scattered oral traditions dismissed for generations as folklore. The problem is context. The Maldives are hard to excavate. Islands shift. Tideserase, Saltcorrodes, and the Redden, for all their craft, left no writing system we can read. There's a chance they used an early form of Daivi Akuru, a script that eventually evolved into the Maldivian Thana alphabet, but it's impossible to prove. What survives are symbols, markings, carvings that might have been names or prayers or nothing, just patterns pretending to be memory. Some archaeologists believe the Redden were connected to the broader Indian Ocean trade network, that they may have been Proto-Dravidian seafarers. Others suggest Austronesian roots. There are even hints of contact with early Arab traders and Persian navigators. But what makes the Redden so strange is not who they were, but how completely they were overwritten. Because the Islamic conversion of the Maldives in 1153 Common Era was total, monuments were destroyed, pre-Islamic practices were demonized, entire histories were scrubbed, rewritten, or left to rot in the humidity. Coral tombs became taboo, ancient rites were outlawed, and slowly, the Redden were unremembered, not just forgotten, intentionally erased. It's a pattern, of course, one we've seen in Zimbabwe, in Rapa Nui, in Petra. The new faith arrives, the old gods are buried, the stones are condemned. What can't be explained is called blasphemy. What can't be used is discarded. The Redden didn't survive that transition, or maybe they did, but only as echoes. Some islanders still whisper stories of the Redden Raja, shadowy kings, with powers drawn from the sea, of spirits trapped in coral blocks, of shrines that cry in the wind. These aren't historical records, they're trauma in mythological clothing. There are even tales mostly dismissed by academics of giants who once roamed the islands, of people who built with coral, like it was wood, of knowledge too dangerous to write down. Fantasy, maybe, but fantasy is often just fact. In exile, what we do know is that in several parts of the Maldives, ancient Havitastillstand, they're not advertised. They're not on tourist maps. Some are half buried, others used as foundations for newer mosques. But their forms remain low circular walls, raised platforms, stepped terraces, built from coral, all outlasting the memory of who made them. Some of the coral stones are carved with what look like faces, others with spiral motifs. A few have been turned upside down or repurposed entirely. It's archaeology by accident, anthropology as rubble. And every time someone digs a well, repaves a road, or clears a coconut grove, a new piece of the puzzle emerges and is quickly ignored. Because what do you do with a civilization that doesn't fit the narrative? The Maldives are now 100% Muslim. Proudly so. The idea that their sacred islands were once ruled by forgotten stone carvers, possibly animists or sun worshippers or something far stranger, doesn't sit well. It gets filed under myths and boxed away. But there are still those who remember, old island families who leave offerings at crumbling shrines, children warned not to walk near certain stones at night, fishermen who swear the sea behaves differently around the oldest Havita because the past never really disappears. It just waits to be named again. And maybe that's what the Redden were trying to do. Not dominate, not conquer, but be remembered. They built with coral, softest of stones. They left no books, no kings, just structures too stubborn to collapse, symbols too vague to translate, and a legacy too threatening to embrace. What kind of civilization does that? One that understood that memory doesn't always need clarity, just presence, just place. And now, let's leave the ocean. Let's head back inland to a place where memory didn't erode. It was burned, where cities were reduced to blackened skeletons, not by fire alone, but by their own hands. You remember them? You met them in the shadow of the Cucuteni Trapilia. But there's another layer beneath that story. Another civilization that destroyed itself ritualistically, cyclically. Only this one built pyramids. You're not in Egypt, you're in Mexico. The builders of Teotihuacan. You walk down the Avenue of the Dead, and it's quiet. Too quiet for a city that once held over 100,000 people. Too quiet for a place called the City of the Gods. Too quiet for what used to be the beating heart of Mesoamerica. Teotihuacan is vast stone plazas that once pulsed with ritual. Pyramids that scrape the sky. The Pyramid of the Sun. The Pyramid of the Moon. Structures built without metal, without the wheel, without beasts of burden. Built by hand, built by intention, and then left behind. Abandoned by its builders, burned, broken, forgotten by name. Today we call it Teotihuacan, a name given by the Aztecs centuries after the fall. It means the place where the gods were born, but the people who built it, we don't know what they called themselves. We don't know what they called their city, because they never told us. The civilization that created Teotihuacan emerged sometime around 100 before Common Era. At its height, between 100 and 600 Common Era, the city was one of the largest in the world, larger than Rome at one point. An empire in stone, multicultural, multilingual, monumental. It wasn't just a religious center. It was a metropolis. There were apartment compounds, markets, obsidian workshops, murals, ceremonial complexes. The city was laid out on a massive grid, meticulously aligned to astronomical points. Urban planning that feels like it came from the mind of a mathematician priest. And that's part of the mystery, because everything about Teotihuacan screams order, and yet it ended in chaos. By 750 Common Era, the city was abandoned, the central temples torched, religious icons smashed, the elite quarters destroyed. It wasn't an invasion. There's no evidence of conquest. No, conquering army. This was internal. This was self-destruction. But why some theories point to environmental degradation, others to class revolt, a society so rigid it finally snapped. Still others to religious schism. Maybe the priests lost control. Maybe the gods stopped listening. Whatever the cause, it was final, and we don't even know who they were. To this day, archaeologists argue over their identity. Were they Totonac, Otomi, Nahua, a fusión, a singular culture, or a confederation of ethnic groups living under one engineered skyline? The murals give us hints. Jaguars, serpents, ceremonial scenes, but not clarity. The glyphs minimal, stylized. Some don't match any known writing system. Teotihuacan wasn't a civilization obsessed with writing. It was a civilization obsessed with space and ritual. The entire city is a cosmogram. The Pyramid of the Sun is aligned with the setting sun on specific dates. The Pyramid of the Moon anchors the northern end of the Avenue of the Dead. The temple of the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl is adorned with serpent heads and surrounded by mass graves. Yes, mass graves. More than 200 sacrificial victims have been found beneath and around the temple of the feathered serpent men, women, and children, some bound, others decapitated, interred with obsidian knives and elaborate adornments. Ritual sacrifice wasn't a side note, it was a foundation. Teotihuacan didn't just build for the gods, it fed them. But at some point, something broke. The sacrifices stopped working, or the priests demanded too much, or the people refused to believe, and then flame. Some researchers believe the burning of the temples and elite compounds was an act of popular revolt, the working classes rising up, tearing down their oppressors, erasing the god kings. If true, it would make Teotihuacan's fall not just a collapse, but a revolution. But then, why didn't they stay? Why not rebuild? Why vanish into the hills? Because maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the goal wasn't to claim the city. Maybe it was to end it. The Aztecs, arriving centuries later, found Teotihuacan as ruins. They didn't try to repopulate it. They didn't rename the gods. They simply worshiped the wreckage. To them, it was divine architecture too sacred to understand, too mysterious to ignore. They walked its streets with awe. They believed gods had been born here. And maybe they were right, because what is divinity if not the power to make something so vast that its builders don't even matter anymore? Teotihuacan is one of those places where absence feels engineered, like its creators knew they wouldn't be remembered, but wanted the stones to speak for them anyway, like they understood that people die, but symmetry can outlast memory. The murals fade, the names vanish, but the shape of the city still points to the sky, and maybe that's the legacy. Not power, not empire, but geometry in service of mystery. You walk down the Avenue of the Dead, and the pyramids loom like questions. You climb the steps, and the wind hits you like a judgment. You look out over the ruins, and you feel something watching. Not ghosts, not gods, possibility. And speaking of possibility, there's a place in the middle of the Indian Ocean where a kingdom once flourished in isolation, a place where writing was sacred, where temples were hidden in mountains, and where the past was deliberately buried, a place called Lemuria. So the legend says, but the actual mystery is real. It's called Kadathal Malai, and the Tamil people still whisper about what's lost beneath its soil. The Shadow Kingdom of Kadathal Malai, somewhere off the southeastern coast of India, beneath the waves of the Bay of Bengal, lies a story too old to be verified and too persistent to be dismissed. It drifts between folklore and archaeology, scripture and shipwreck, like a ghost of a continent long since drowned. The name it's given is Lemuria, a mythical landmass once believed to connect India to Madagascar. Submerged by tectonic whim or divine judgment, science discarded the idea over a century ago, but Tamil tradition never did. They call it Kumari Kandam. And if Lemuria is a theory, Kumari Kandam is a grief. But let's not start with myths. Let's start with Kadathal Malai, a real place, a hill temple, a ruin swallowed by soil and superstition, a site that may be the last surviving whisper of a lost kingdom, so old it's spoken of in Tamil literature, Tamil's ancient poetic epics. The name Kadathal Malai roughly means the hill that was crossed, though some translate it as the hill of passage, and that ambiguity is fitting because everything about this site feels like a transition point between history and legend, sea and memory, myth and loss. Located in Tamil Nadu, not far from the ancient port city of Korkai, Kadathal Malai is one of many elevated sites, dotted with collapsed shrines, weather-worn carvings, and subterranean chambers. Archaeologists haven't officially excavated much of it, mostly due to logistical challenges, and perhaps a little due to academic caution. Because what if the stories are true? Local legends say the hill was once part of a much larger temple complex devoted to Tamil seafarers, sages, and sunken gods. They say the hill is all that remains of an empire, swallowed by the sea, an empire of advanced knowledge, linguistic mastery, and moral failure. The Tamil epics, especially the Silappatikaram and the commentaries of medieval poets, make cryptic references to lands lost to the floods, kingdoms that sank in sorrow, and cities of learning that vanished because the people forgot the truth. It's poetic, but maybe it's not just poetry. Because marine archaeology along the Tamil coast has uncovered submerged ruins, stone blocks, possible pierre structures, ancient anchor stones off the coasts of Poompuhar and Mahabalipuram, these may not prove the existence of Kumari Kandam, but they do prove that ancient Tamil kingdoms had coastal infrastructure, now underwater, and the timelines get blurry fast. Ancient Tamil scholars claimed that 3 sangams, poetic academies, existed across time, the first of which supposedly lasted 4,400 years and was located in a now-lost land south of modern India. Its destruction, they said, was a moral reckoning, a flood, not just of water, but of consequence. And this is where Kadathal Malai returns to focus. Some say the hill was a watchpoint, a place to observe the sea's advance. Others claim it was a sanctuary, a last stand for survivors who fled the rising tides. A few fringe theorists argue that the inscriptions found on nearby stones hint at astronomical alignments, dates of celestial conjunctions, warnings of eclipses, and references to starborn floods, but the actual inscriptions are minimal, worn, fragmented, often unreadable, which makes them perfect for speculation. Because what do you do with a history that refuses to verify itself? Kadathal Malai doesn't confirm anything. It just exists quietly. It watches, and in its silence, it seems to suggest, look deeper. And so people do. They bring offerings. They chant old songs. They trace their fingers along weathered carvings. That might be script, or might be erosion. They light lamps at night, believing the hill contains spirits who remember a world before the waves. And maybe it does. Maybe the sea did take more than we know. Maybe Lemuria isn't real, but loss is, and Kumarikandam, whether landmass or metaphor, speaks to something deeper than tectonics. It speaks to the idea that language, culture, and civilization can vanish without conquest, that a people can be so deeply rooted in oral tradition that when catastrophe comes, all that survives is a riddle wrapped in grief. And maybe that's why Kadathal Malai still feels heavy, not physically, spiritually, like it's mourning something it doesn't quite remember. Because what if the true collapse of a civilization isn't when the last building falls, but when the last meaning fails to be passed on? We tend to think in dates, empires, facts. But Kadathal Malai doesn't care about that. It's not here to prove anything. It's here to linger, to ask, to haunt. The Tamil language is one of the oldest still spoken. It survived colonization, globalization, digitization, but part of its soul lives on in ruins like Kadathal Malai, in unmarked stones, in unname grief, in the knowledge that something great was lost, and that greatness doesn't need to be proven to be missed, because some disappearances don't require disaster, just the turning away of time. And now let's return to the West, to the edge of the known world, where glaciers once ruled, and myths still flicker in stone, a place not known for cities or pyramids, but for stone circles, bone tools, and a mystery far older than agriculture. Angkor, the city that drowned in its own reflection. They called it the City of Temples. But that undersells the scale. Angkor wasn't just a city, it was a world. A metropolis spread across more than 400 square kilometers, with roads, canals, reservoirs, towers, bridges, hydraulic precision stitched into jungle. It wasn't carved into a mountain, it built the mountain, and at its heart, Angkor Wat, the largest religious monument ever constructed on Earth. Still standing, still perfect, still haunted. But the most unnerving thing about Angkor isn't its size, it's how it vanished. Not with a bang. Not from war. Not in conquest. But in a slow-motion drowning. One mistake at a time. Let's rewind. Angkor was the capital of the Khmer Empire from the 9th to the 15th century Common Era, a time when Europe was choking on its own ignorance, and the Khmer were building cities on water, not just near water. On it, around it, With it, they mastered hydraulic engineering, giant barrages, reservoirs, moats, canals, sluice gates designed not only to irrigate but to regulate spiritual harmony. Water wasn't just a resource, it was cosmic architecture. They built Angkor as a mandala in stone. Temples, mirrored constellations, towers, aligned with solstices. The city was designed to reflect heaven, a terrestrial double of a divine blueprint. Angkor Wat, with its 5 lotus bud towers, is a symbolic model of Mount Meru, center of the universe in Hindu cosmology. It's not a building, it's a cosmological machine. Every carving has a story, every corridor has a direction, every line is a law. And yet, for all its control, Angkor couldn't save itself. By the late 1300s, the empire was fraying. By the 1400s, it was gone. Not razed, not burned, abandoned. Theories abound, because of course they do. Some say it was climate change. Others blame the rise of Theravada Buddhism, which displaced the god-king ideology Angkor was built on. Still others cite warfare Thai invasions from Ayutthaya, or internal decay, or hydraulic failure. A system so intricate that when it broke, the city couldn't survive its own collapse. And that's the metaphor that refuses to leave. The city drowned in its reflection. Angkor wasn't just a city on water. It was a city obsessed with balance of spiritual, ecological, divine. But in trying to control every drop, they forgot something vital. Systems break. When the floods came, they overwhelmed the canals. When the droughts came, the reservoirs cracked. And when the spiritual authority of the kings collapsed, the temples became relics. The jungle moved back in slowly, gently, with vines instead of swords. By the time French explorers rediscovered Angkor in the 19th century, it was barely a rumor. Locals knew of it. Of course, they left offerings, whispered stories. But to the Western world, it was a revelation. How could this have been built here, by them? It didn't fit the imperial narrative. So the same pattern played out. Doubt, denial, then appropriation. Some credited Indians, others the Chinese. A few lunatics floated the usual suspects: aliens, Atlanteans, ghost kings from lost continents. Because a civilization this sophisticated, this poetic, couldn't possibly have been Southeast Asian. But it was, and still is. Angkor is not a corpse. It's a sleeping body. Cambodia still carries its blood in language, in art, in dance, in ritual. The temples are alive, with visitors now. Tourists in cargo shorts walk the same steps kings once took in bare feet. Instagrammers snap selfies against bas-reliefs of apocalyptic churning oceans, unaware they're standing in a metaphor for the collapse of balance. Because Angkor didn't fall from laziness, it fell from perfection, from control stretched too tight, from reflection turned to obsession. And that's the moral. Sometimes the most beautiful structures are the most fragile. Sometimes a civilization builds heaven on earth and forgets how to live in it. The irony: the temples survived, the canals still work, the jungle returned, what the empire tried to dominate. Angkor, the city that drowned in its own reflection. They called it the City of Temples, but that undersells the scale. Angkor wasn't just a city, it was a world, a metropolis spread across more than 400 square kilometers with roads, canals, reservoir, towers, bridges, hydraulic precision, stitched into jungle. It wasn't carved into a mountain, it built the mountain, and at its heart, Angkor Wat, the largest religious monument ever constructed on Earth. Still standing. Still perfect. Still haunted. But the most unnerving thing about Angkor isn't its size, it's how it vanished. Not with a bang. Not from war. Not in conquest. But in a slow-motion drowning, one mistake at a time. Let's rewind. Angkor was the capital of the Khmer Empire from the 9th to the 15th century Common Era. A time when Europe was choking on its own ignorance, and the Khmer were building cities on water, not just near water, on it, around it, with it. They mastered hydraulic engineering giant berets, reservoirs, moats, canals, sluice gates designed not only to irrigate, but to regulate spiritual harmony. Water wasn't just a resource, it was cosmic architecture. They built Angkor as a mandala in stone, temples, mirrored constellations, towers aligned with solstices. The city was designed to reflect heaven, a terrestrial double of a divine blueprint. Angkor Wat, with its 5 lotus bud towers, is a symbolic model of Mount Meru, center of the universe in Hindu cosmology. It's not a building, it's a cosmological machine. Every carving has a story. Every corridor has a direction. Every line is a law. And yet, for all its control, Angkor couldn't save itself. By the late 1300s, the empire was fraying. By the 1400s, it was gone. Not razed, not burned, abandoned. Theories abound, because of course they do. Some say it was climate change. Others blame the rise of Theravada Buddhism, which displaced the god-king ideology Angkor was built on. Still others cite warfare, Thai invasions from Ayutthaya, or internal decay, or hydraulic failure. A system so intricate that when it broke, the city couldn't survive its own collapse. And that's the metaphor that refuses to leave. The city drowned in its reflection. Angkor wasn't just a city on water. It was a city obsessed with balance of spiritual, ecological, divine. But in trying to control every drop, they forgot something vital. Systems break. When the floods came, they overwhelmed the canals. When the droughts came, the reservoirs cracked. And when the spiritual authority of the kings collapsed, the temples became relics. The jungle moved back in slowly, gently, with vines instead of swords. By the time French explorers rediscovered Angkor in the 19th century, it was barely a rumor. Locals knew of it. Of course, they left offerings, whispered stories. But to the Western world, it was a revelation. How could this have been built here? By them, it didn't fit the imperial narrative. So the same pattern played out. Doubt, denial, then appropriation. Some credited Indians, others the Chinese. A few lunatics floated the usual suspects. Aliens, Atlanteans, ghost kings from lost continents. Because a civilization this sophisticated, this poetic, couldn't possibly have been Southeast Asian. But it was, and still is. Angkor is not a corpse. It's a sleeping body. Cambodia still carries its blood in language, in art, in dance, in ritual. The temples are alive with visitors. Now, tourists in cargo shorts walk the same steps kings once took in bare feet. Instagrammers snap selfies against bas-reliefs of apocalyptic churning oceans, unaware they're standing in a metaphor for the collapse of balance. Because Angkor didn't fall from laziness. It fell from perfection, from control stretched too tight, from reflection turned to obsession. And that's the moral. Sometimes the most beautiful structures are the most fragile. Sometimes a civilization builds heaven on earth and forgets how to live in it. The irony, the temples survived, the canals still work, the jungle returned what the empire tried to dominate. The Wari Empire, the empire before empires. Long before the Inca carved Machu Picchu into the bones of the Andes, before they built their mountain-spanning highways and sun temples, there was someone else, someone quieter, stranger, more organized, more vanished. They were called the Wari, and they may have invented the concept of empire in South America, only to erase themselves from it before the final act. If you've never heard of the Wari, you're not alone. Most people skip straight to the Inca, as if they appeared out of nowhere. Fully formed, gold-plated, and sun-kissed, but the Inca didn't start from zero. They inherited from someone from this. The Wari rose around 600 Common Era and held power for almost 500 years. Their territory, stretched across much of present-day Peru coastal deserts, Andean highlands, jungle edges. Not an empire by conquest, an empire by infrastructure, because the Wari didn't just build. They planned, they constructed administrative centers, road systems, urban grids, agricultural terraces. They developed water management systems in arid regions. They spread a state religion, and then they disappeared so efficiently, they took most of their name with them. Let's talk about Wari proper, the capital. At its peak, it may have housed over 40,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time, but it wasn't a ceremonial space like Teotihuacan. It was a bureaucratic machine, rectangular buildings, modular zones, warehouses, roads, complex waste management systems. The whole place feels like it was designed by an accountant with delusions of grandeur. They built compounds around courtyards, walled off, segregated, tightly controlled. Elites lived apart, artisans worked under supervision, access to food, water, and movement, all regulated. This wasn't chaos, this was control. But what makes the Wari really disturbing isn't what they built, it's how little they cared about being remembered. Unlike the Inca, they didn't write epic histories. They didn't obsess over immortality. Their temples were practical. Their art was abstract. Their records, if they existed, they're gone. And then there's the burials. The Wari were big on ancestor veneration, storing mummies, rearranging bones, creating subterranean shrines for elite dead. Some were buried beneath the floorboards of homes. Others were placed in sealed tombs, heads removed and displayed. One site, recently uncovered near Lima, contained over 60 individuals, carefully wrapped, ritually posed, entombed with ceramic guardians and miniature effigies, whole families, and then, at some point, sealed off and forgotten. It's as if they didn't want to be remembered. They wanted to be preserved in secrecy. The collapse of the Wari around 1000 Common Era is almost surreal in its lack of explanation. No mass graves, no sign of war, just evacuation. Cities emptied, infrastructure abandoned, culture gone. The Inca rose about 400 years later, and guess what? They copied the roads, the administration centers, even the idea of state religion, but they never mentioned the Wari by name, because by then, the Wari weren't just dead. They were erased. Archaeologists are only now starting to put the puzzle together, and they hate how little there is to work with. What survives is fragmentary textiles with haunting geometric faces, ceramics depicting deities no one can name, urban plants that feel eerily modern and disturbingly soulless. Some scholars suggest that the Wari collapsed due to over-centralization. Their control mechanisms were so rigid that once stress hit, drought, famine, descent, the whole thing shattered like brittle clay. But what if it wasn't collapse? What if it was retreat? What if the Wari, masters of systems, saw the system failing and simply walked away? They didn't destroy their cities. They didn't burn their temples. They just disappeared. Which brings us back to a pattern we've seen over and over. The most advanced civilizations don't go out in flames. They go out like a breath, silent, deliberate, untraceable. Because some empires are built to last, others are built to disappear. So completely, they become cautionary tales, disguised as footnotes. And, speaking of empires lost in the footnotes, let's go to East Africa, to a kingdom so advanced, it minted its own coins, carved obelisks taller than churches, and traded with Rome, India, and Byzantium, a civilization praised in the Bible. A city lost beneath dust and denial, Axum, the empire that vanished into the stone. In the highlands of northern Ethiopia, surrounded by mountains that cracked the sky and clouds that move like secrets, there once stood a city of stone. Its kings minted gold coins, stamped with crosses and crowns. Its merchants traded with Byzantium, Persia, and India. Its name appeared in Roman records, Islamic texts, and even the Hebrew Bible. And then, like a candle in wind, it was gone. This was Axum, and it may be the most powerful empire you've never heard of. Let's rewind to the first few centuries of the Common Era. Rome was choking on decadence. Han China was imploding. India was fracturing into kingdoms. And in East Africa, Axum was rising. From roughly 100 Common Era to 700 Common Era, Axum controlled a territory stretching across modern-day Ethiopia, Eritrea, parts of Sudan, Djibouti, and Yemen. It wasn't just an African kingdom. It was a maritime superpower, ruling both sides of the Red Sea. Its capital, also called Axum, was a hub of trade, diplomacy, religion, and something much harder to explain, permanence. Because Axum didn't just build cities, it built monuments that refused to fall. The stelae of Axum are some of the most eerie, majestic, and completely unexplainable constructions in all of antiquity. Towering obelisks, some over 30 meters tall, carved from single pieces of granite, decorated with false doors and windows, like stone skyscrapers from a parallel timeline. One was so massive, it likely collapsed during installation. Another was stolen by Mussolini's troops in the 1930s and returned only recently. These weren't tomb markers. They were statements of power, of legacy, of something spiritual. We no longer understand because we don't know how they moved them or why they stopped. The kings of Axum ruled with divine authority. Inscriptions describe them as conquerors, but also as architects of order, bringing irrigation, law, religion. They were among the first sub-Saharan rulers to adopt Christianity, around 330 Common Era, long before most of Europe got the memo. They even built churches with stone crossbeams, still standing today, untouched by time or war. Axum minted its own coins, gold, silver, bronze inscribed in Greek and later in Ge'ez, the ancient Ethiopian script. These coins made their way as far as India and Rome. They were small, round ambassadors of a civilization, confident in its place in the world. But the place changed. By the 7th century, something began to shift. Trade routes that had once fed Axum's ports now flowed through Islamic states. The Red Sea became a hostile border. Internal power began to fragment. The climate shifted droughts. Soil déplétion, overfarming. Axum began to shrink. Not catastrophically, just incrementally, like an empire, realizing its time was over. By the 10th century, the capital had moved to the highlands. By the 12th, the old city was mostly abandoned. By the time European explorers arrived, centuries later, all that was left were the obelisks, the church ruins, the coin fragments, and a people who remembered pieces. But the full story gone. There are no detailed Axumite chronicles, no surviving libraries. Most of what we know comes from outsiders: Greeks, Romans, Persians, or from fragmented stone inscriptions that speak like telegrams from ghosts. Axum had its own written language, but it wasn't used to write down history the way the Romans did. It was used to encode ritual, liturgy, God, not government, and that silence opened a vacuum colonialists were only too happy to fill. For years, historians dismissed Axum as myth. They couldn't believe an African empire had reached so far, built so high, or existed so early. They assumed the obelisks were foreign, the coins were imported, the architecture was influenced, because the idea that Africans could have done this themselves, that was the real mystery. But here's the truth. Axum was real. It was powerful. It was complex. And it was deliberately unpreserved. Because the Axumites didn't build to be remembered. They built to be sacred. And when the sacred turned silent, they let it go. Today, the town of Axum is quiet. The obelisks still rise. The old tombs still echo. And the churches, some of them still function, still whisper prayers in the ancient tongue. Tourists come and leave. Archaeologists scratch the surface. Locals walk among the ruins, like they're part of the air. Because maybe they are. Maybe some civilizations never vanish. They just fold into myth so perfectly, so seamlessly, you stop seeing them as fact. You start seeing them as inevitable. But they weren't. Axum. Axum ruled. Axum fell and left a city made of stone and questions made of silence. And now we head east to a city buried in jungle. Not legend, a place where language flourished and then shut itself down, where temples were so precise they rivaled computers, where calendars predicted eclipses and endings. And then the ending came, the Maya collapse, the civilization that predicted its own vanishing. It didn't happen all at once. There was no volcanic apocalypse. No sweeping invasion. No single final battle written in blood. The Maya didn't vanish in a moment. They vanished in chapters, in pauses, in gasps, in a silence that stretched over a century, so slowly that even the stars might have missed it. And yet somehow they knew it was coming. You've heard the myth that the Maya predicted the end of the world in 2012, a pop culture punchline built from a misunderstanding of an ancient calendar. The truth is far more unsettling, because the Maya didn't predict the end of the world. They predicted endings repeatedly, cycles of rise and fall of kings, of cities, of civilizations, including their own. Let's go back, way back. The Maya civilization flourished across what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador from around 20,000 before Common Era to the arrival of the Spanish in the 1500s. They built one of the most advanced and enigmatic cultures in human history. At their peak classic period, roughly 250 to 900 Common Era, they carved cities out of rainforest, cities like Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, Palenque, Caracol temples, observatories, ball courts, pyramids. They didn't just stack stones. They engineered cosmic theaters. The Maya understood time better than most modern people. They didn't see it as linear. They saw it as layered, recursive, symbolic. Their long count calendar tracked dates across thousands of years. They calculated lunar cycles, eclipses, planetary movements with an accuracy NASA still respects. They wrote in glyphs, one of the few fully developed writing systems of the ancient Americas. They recorded history, astronomy, war, royal births, deaths, cosmic alignments. Their temples are textbooks made of stone. But sometime around 800 Common Era, something began to change. Cities were suddenly abandoned. Temples were left half-finished. Elite monuments stopped being carved. Stelae, those towering historical markers, fell silent. This was the classic Maya collapse. And no one really agrees why it happened. Some cities like Tikal and Copan declined rapidly. Others like Chichen Itza in the north flourished much later. There was no single timeline, no singular fall, just a wave of disappearances rolling from south to north. So what caused it? Pick your poison? Climate change? The evidence is there. Sediment cores suggest a series of massive droughts between 800 and 1000 Common Era. Overpopulation. Many Maya cities had densities rivaling modern urban sprawl, which would have put intense pressure on agriculture and water supply. Political collapse. Cities warred constantly, forging and breaking alliances, betraying kin, overthrowing kings. When the gods stopped answering, so did the armies. Environmental exhaustion, deforestation, slash and burn farming, and land degradation could have hollowed out the ecosystem from the inside. Spiritual crisis, when rituals no longer worked, when kings failed to summon rain, when temples stood empty. Faith may have cracked like stone under heat. And here's the strangest theory. They saw it coming. Inscriptions from the late classic period grow increasingly apocalyptic. Some monuments reference endings not of time itself, but of cycles, cities, dynasties. The word Chahom appears, meaning collapse, break, or release. As if the Maya understood they were approaching a threshold, not the end, just a turning. Some scholars even believe the Maya elites, steeped in their cyclical worldview, may have interpreted the collapse not as failure, but as cosmic inevitability, a necessary sacrifice, a divine punctuation mark. In that way, the Maya didn't just fail, they followed through, which is worse. Here's what makes the collapse so eerie. The Maya left everything behind and almost nothing at all. The cities still stand, at least their skeletons do. The temples are intact. The glyphs still whisper. But the meaning fragmented, mangled, missing. It took centuries before we even began to decipher their writing. Many of their codices, folding books of bark paper, were burned by Spanish priests who declared them heresy. Only 4 survived. An entire civilization's philosophy, its science, its calendar, its soul, reduced to 4 books, written in symbols we only started to understand after the moon landing. And yet the Maya didn't die. Their descendants are still here in Chiapas. In Guatemala, in Yucatan, they still speak Maya languages, still honor the gods in secret or in syncretism, still walk among the ruins of their ancestors, carrying bloodlines deeper than limestone. The Maya didn't vanish. They contracted, like a breath held in memory, like a prophecy. Only they were willing to believe, and maybe, in a darkly ironic twist, they were right. Because what if the Maya collapse wasn't a collapse at all? What if it was a reset? A strategic withdrawal from a pattern that had run its course? We keep looking for disaster when the answer might be deliberate dissolution. And that brings us naturally to a place much colder, much newer, but equally unsettling. A remote island where an entire Viking colony vanished. Not in battle, not in disease, but in abandonment, where graves still sit beneath frost, where churches outlasted the people who built them, where the silence of snow sounds exactly like a civilization being forgotten. The Norse of Greenland, the colony that froze its own future. There's cold, and then there's Greenland cold. The kind that doesn't just numb your skin, it compresses time. The kind of cold that preserves bone, but erases context. The kind where even memory gets frostbite. And somewhere beneath that permafrost, scattered across the fjords and valleys of Greenland's southern edge, lie the remains of a people who should have thrived, and instead simply stopped. No final battle, no invading army, no volcanic eruption, just a quiet glacial exit. This was the Norse colony of Greenland, founded by Eric the Red in the late 10th century, a Viking outpost turned Christian commonwealth, sustained for nearly 500 years, until it wasn't. And the worst part, they saw it coming and did nothing. Let's rewind to 985 Common Era, Eric the Red, fresh off in exile from Iceland. Because Viking drama is never subtle, sets sail west and finds a massive icy landmass, Greenland. He names it strategically. Greenland sounded much more appealing than endless icy Death Island, and returns to Iceland to recruit settlers. A few hundred follow him. They established 2 main settlements, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement. Names as exciting as a tax ledger. They bring cattle, sheep, pigs. They build longhouses, churches, farms. They write sagas. They plant roots. And for a while, it works. At its peak, the colony may have housed over 5,000 people. They traded with Europe, walrus ivory, seal skins, even polar bear edis. They sent bishops to Rome. They built cathedrals out of imported timber and native stone. They were on the map, but maps lie, because beneath that surface of piety and self-sufficiency, the Norse Greenlanders were playing a very dangerous game, pretending Greenland was just like Norway, just colder, just a bit more challenging. But Greenland isn't Norway. Its soil is thinner, its summers are shorter, its resources are more fragile, its climate, well, escalating. By the 1300s, the Little Ice Age had begun an extended period of cooling that hit Greenland like a divine eviction notice. Harvests fail, livestock starved, drift ice blocked ships. The last known contact with Europe was in the early 1400s. After that, silence. The Western settlement vanished first. By the mid-1300s, It was completely abandoned. The eastern settlement lingered another century, and then nothing. When Danish missionaries arrived in the 1700s, they found ruined stone churches filled with snow, collapsed barns, skeletons buried properly, but without continuity. No survivors. No stories. Just a frozen question mark. So, what happened? Again, pick your poison. Klimatkollaps. Definitely. The cooling climate shortened growing seasons, killed pasture, and made sea travel almost impossible. Economic isolation. European trade shifted. The market for walrus ivory collapsed. Greenland became irrelevant. Cultural rigidity. Probably the most damning. The Norse refused to adapt. They clung to cattle-based agriculture. Even as their livestock starved, they ignored Inuit hunting techniques. They wouldn't eat seal until it was too late. They were Vikings who refused to go full Viking. And then there's the archaeological smoking gun. The last farm sites show increasingly poor nutrition, smaller livestock, more signs of desperation. And the final graves, frozen in soil, still Christian, still proud, buried as if they were going to church next Sunday. They died pretending nothing was wrong. No signs of violence. No mas graves, just disappearance. This is perhaps what makes the Norse Greenlanders so haunting. They had every warning sign. They had alternatives, Inuit neighbors who survived the same conditions, but they refused to adapt. They chose familiarity over survival, and in doing so, they became a lesson written in snow. Even today, the ruins remain. The church at Lolsey, one of the best preserved Norse ruins in Greenland, still stands. Stone walls, arched doorways, a place made to last, and inside silence. It was here, in 1408, that the last written record from Norse Greenland was made a wedding. Think about that. The final official act of a dying civilization was a marriage, a promise made in a freezing cathedral with no food, no future, no ships on the horizon, and then nothing. No one knows what happened to the last families. Did they starve, leave, intermarry with the Inuit, and disappear into genetic memory? No sagas tell the tale, because sometimes collapse doesn't get a storyteller, it just gets frostbite. And so the Norse of Greenland become another chapter in our growing list of people who were smart, sophisticated, connected, and still failed, not because they were weak, but because they were stubborn, because they thought tradition could outlast temperature, because they believed civilization was a fortress, not a tent in the wind. And speaking of tents in the wind, let's go now to the steppe, to the vast empty spaces where empires flickered like candlelight, where warriors built cities not of stone but memory, where a whole civilization rose, traded, ruled, and then became a rumor. The Xiongnu. You've heard of the Huns. You've heard of the Mongols. But before both, before Attila, before Genghis, there was a name that echoed across Asia like a storm in waiting. Xiongnu. And for a while, they were the boogeymen of the Han Dynasty, the invisible empire, the enemy with no city, the horse lords who didn't just ride the steppe, they were the steppe. They lived in motion, fought like ghosts, and then, when they vanished, they left behind almost nothing. Just a strange, unsettling question. Who the hell were they? Let's set the stage. Around the 3rd century, before Common Era, a confederation of nomadic tribes coalesced in what is now Mongolia. They were not farmers, not city builders. They were herders, archers, raiders, and they were fast. By 209 before Common Era, under the leadership of Modu Chanyu, the Xiongnu had formed the first true empire on the Eurasian steppe. An empire that could rival, harass, and even extort China. Yes, extort. The Han Dynasty literally paid them off with silk, gold, princesses, in exchange for not being raided that year. This wasn't weakness. It was policy. Because the Xiongnu weren't a scattered group of barbarians. They were a machine, a mobile, multi-ethnic confederacy with a warrior aristocracy, a chain of vassal kings, and a communication network that moved faster than any imperial courier. Their lifestyle was alien to the Chinese court. No palaces, no fortresses, just fältens, shifting pastures, and untraceable revenge. And so, in typical bureaucratic fashion, the Han did what terrified states always do. They built a wall, a very long wall, one that later emperors would expand into the Great Wall of China because of the Xiongnu. That's right, the Great Wall wasn't built for some poetic metaphor. It was a panic project, a hedge against the Shadow Empire to the north. But walls are for people who stay still, and the Xiongnu didn't. They raided, they retreated, they demanded tribute, they married into courts, they ambushed supply lines, they melted into the horizon, and they terrified everyone. Because how do you fight an empire with no center? Eventually, the Han got sick of being hustled and launched counter-campaigns. For a while, they worked on generals pushed north, took territory, turned rival tribes. By the 1st century, Common Era, the Xiongnu Confederation began to splinter, civil war, factions, defections. Some Xiongnu joined the Han, others vanished into the steppe, others moved west, farther west than anyone expected. And here's where the mystery deepens, because a few centuries later, a new group shows up in Europe. They don't farm, they don't write, they ride fast, they fight dirty, they come out of nowhere and leave nothing but ashes. They're called the Huns, and some historians whisper, what if the Huns were the Xiongnu? It's speculative. Linguistic threads, genetic shadows, cultural echoes, but it's enough to keep the theory alive. Because the Roman sources, when describing the Huns, use the same tone the Han used for the Xiongnu terror-struck resignation. They arrive, they devastate, they disappear, and you have no idea what they want. But here's the twist. Despite all the fear, despite all the imperial treaties, military campaigns, and terrified chroniclers, we know almost nothing about the Xiongnu themselves. They left no written record of their own, no epic inscriptions, no stele boasting of their victories. No, central capital in stone. They were oral, nomadic, modular. Their tombs, those we found, are rich, with grave goods, bronze mirrors, gold jewelry, horse trappings, but the identity of the buried obscure. No names carved in eternity, just bones and questions. Even their exact language is unknown. Proto-Turkic, Proto-Mongolic, something else entirely. We don't know, because they didn't write it down. Or if they did, it's gone, which makes them feel less like a civilization and more like a force of nature. A gust of wind that flattened dynasties, a shadow cast by hooves over history's brittle timeline, a reminder that not every empire leaves ruins. Some leave only reactions. And in that way, the Xiongnu may have been the most modern of ancient civilizations. Their power wasn't static, it was relational. They didn't rule with monuments. They ruled with momentum. They weren't building legacies, they were building uncertainty. And when their time was done, they didn't collapse. They migrated into myth. Because the steppe doesn't remember you with statues. It remembers you with fear. And that brings us to a different kind of fear. Not the nomadic kind, not the icy kind, not the ghost of empire kind, but the kind that whispers, what if there was a city so advanced, so perfect, so spiritual, that even its own people couldn't live up to it? Mohenjo-Daro, the city that forgot what it was for. It doesn't look like much at first, just crumbling brick walls, straight streets choked with dust, an old bath, a broken well, a silence that clings to everything, like the scent of something once alive. This is Mohenjo-Daro, crown jewel of the Indus Valley civilization. Once a city of order, symmetry, and cleanliness, Now, a riddle made of baked mud and vanished purpose. Let's start with the facts. We do know Mohenjo-Daro was built around 2600 before Common Era in what is today southern Pakistan. It was one of the largest cities in the world at the time, part of the Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan Civilization, which spanned over 1 million square kilometers and housed upward of 5 million people at its peak. That's bigger than ancient Egypt, bigger than Mesopotamia, and yet most people can't name a single Indus king. Because here's the catch: they had no palaces, no pyramids, no monuments to ego, no clear evidence of war, no royal tombs, and no writing system we can read. Just cities so clean, they'd make modern urban planners weep. Mohenjo-Daro wasn't a city. It was a blueprint. Its streets were laid out on a precise north-south grid. Homes had indoor plumbing, multi-room dwellings, septic systems, the world's first known flush toilets, and at the center of it all, the most iconic feature, the Great Bath, a massive public bathing structure made from carefully fitted bricks sealed with bitumen, complete with inlets and drains. It wasn't just for hygiene. It was ritual, a purification site, a spiritual heartbeat. The spiritual before the spectacular. The people of Mohenjo-Daro seemed less interested in worshiping gods with gold and more focused on keeping their water clean, which raises a question. What kind of civilization prioritizes sanitation over spectacle, whatever they were? The Harappans were obsessed with order-uniform brick sizes across the region, standardized weights and measures, carefully controlled trade goods. They traded with Mesopotamia, with coastal cities, possibly even with Egypt. Their seal scarabs, stone stamps used for trade or identification, feature strange animals, composite beasts, and an undeciphered script. That script still unbroken. Over 4,000 examples found, none translated. Why? Because it's not alphabetic, not syllabic, possibly not even linguistic in the way we understand language. It may be a proto-writing system, a set of ritual symbols meant to be understood by insiders and no one else, which means that unless we find a bilingual Rosetta Stone, the Indus script may stay silent forever. And that silence is deafening, because it's not just that we don't know what the Harappans believed, it's that we don't even know if they had gods. There are no temples, no idols, just small figurines. Some female, some animal, some horned, some seated in yoga-like poses. Hints, echoes, never declarations, no conquest narratives, no murals of battles, no divine kings parading through eternity. It's like they didn't want to be remembered the way other empires did. And then, somewhere around 1900 before Common Era, Mohenjo-Daro and the rest of the Indus Valley cities began to decline. The streets cracked, the drains clogged, the bricks stopped matching, and finally, people left. Not all at once, not in terror, in drift. So what happened? Once again, choose your apocalypse. Rivers shift the Indus, and its tributaries were unpredictable. If the rivers moved, the cities lost their lifelines. Climate change. There's evidence of drought, swell salinity, environmental strain, overextended trade networks, resource scarcity, internal stagnation, cultural fatigue. A civilization built on balance may not know what to do with disruption. And then there's the absence of violence. That's the strange part. You'd expect to find signs of war-burned layers, mass graves, defensive walls, but there's almost nothing. Just a few scattered skeletons, unburied, some face down in the street, as if they fell, and no one came back for them. Archaeologists once thought Mohenjo-Daro ended in massacre, but later studies disprove that. No mass killings, no siege, just abandonment. And now it sits in ruin. The Great Bath is dry, the grid is crumbling, the order is broken, and we don't even know what they called it. Mohenjo-Daro means Mound of the Dead, a name given by modern locals. not ancient architects. So here's the real question. What kind of civilization builds a nearly utopian city clean, efficient, peaceful, interconnected, and forgets to leave a message? Was it humility or hubris? Did they think they'd last forever? Or did they believe their work would speak for them? It did, but we don't understand the language. And that's the final irony. They may have built one of the most advanced cities in the ancient world, and it didn't matter, because when the rivers moved, and the script was forgotten, and the bath dried up, no one remembered what it was all for. Which brings us finally to one last question. Not who built it, not why did they vanish, but what if vanishing was the plan? Some civilizations build for eternity, others build for a moment, and some, like Mohenjo-Daro, build something so perfect, so symmetrical, so without ego, that when the time comes to leave, they don't burn it, they don't bury it, they just forget, and someone, thousands of years later, stares at the bricks and asks, was this a city or a mirror? And now we come full circle. Mohenjo-Daro joins the others in our story Göbekli Tepe, Teotihuacan, Great Zimbabwe, Cahokia, each vanished, each brilliant, each refusing to leave behind a clean explanation. Because maybe the point isn't what we lost. Maybe the point is that we still don't understand what we're looking at. These were civilizations that didn't just die. They withdrew like a tide, like a breath, like a lesson you weren't ready to learn yet. And so they wait in stone, in silence, in questions shaped like cities. Because the greatest mystery isn't why they vanished. It's why we keep doing the same thing over and over, building, forgetting, collapsing, repeating. And maybe that's the final warning. The past didn't vanish. It's watching now, always. From under the sand, from under the sea, from under your feet, whispering, you will vanish too. And no one will remember the name you gave your temples, only the silence you left behind, only the mystery, only the question,